Before the bombs fell, there were flight decks crowded with decisions. By June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had expanded across the Pacific with speed that fractured Allied defenses. In 6 months, it had struck Pearl Harbor, seized the Philippines, occupied the Dutch East Indies, and pushed toward the Solomon Islands. Its carrier force had sunk or disabled battleships and cruisers measured in tens of thousands of tons. On paper, it held initiative. Beneath that surface, arithmetic began to erode advantage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto devised the Midway operation as a trap. The plan required splitting forces across hundreds of miles of ocean. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the striking core. Each displaced roughly 20,000 tons and carried around 70 aircraft. Battleships and cruisers followed in separate groups. The objective: draw out the remaining American carriers and destroy them in a decisive engagement. The plan assumed surprise. It also assumed incomplete American intelligence. American codebreakers had partially deciphered Japanese naval communications. When I was studying translated intercept summaries alongside Japanese operational orders, I noticed how often American estimates aligned within narrow margins of Japanese planning. The supposed fog of war had thinned. The American Navy knew Midway would be targeted and positioned its carriers accordingly. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island, dropping bombs measured in hundreds of pounds onto runways and fuel tanks. Pilots reported incomplete destruction and requested a second strike. On the carrier decks, ordnance crews recalibrated. Bombs intended for ship attack were removed. Land attack bombs were hoisted. Torpedoes weighing nearly 2,000 pounds each were shifted below deck. Fuel hoses snaked across hangar floors. Aircraft were armed, disarmed, rearmed. Inside those hangars, volatility increased with each minute. Aviation fuel vapors hung in the air. Bomb racks lay open. Torpedoes rested unsecured. Decision cycles lengthened as reports from scouting planes arrived late and incomplete. One scout eventually sighted American ships, but failed initially to identify carriers. The delay fractured clarity. Meanwhile, American carrier groups approached. The United States fielded 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, each displacing over 20,000 tons. American air groups launched in waves, often without tight coordination. Torpedo squadrons attacked first, flying low and slow. They suffered casualty rates exceeding 60% in minutes under concentrated anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. Aircraft fell into the sea in burning fragments. Those attacks, however, altered altitude and focus. Japanese fighters descended to sea level to intercept torpedo planes. Combat air patrol patterns thinned overhead. At that moment, American dive bombers arrived at high altitude. In a span of minutes, bombs weighing 1,000 pounds each struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Hangar decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft ignited. Explosions fractured internal bulkheads. Fires raged beyond containment. Steel hulls that displaced tens of thousands of tons could not compensate for compromised damage control amid exposed ordnance. Within hours, 3 carriers were doomed. Hiryu launched counterstrikes that crippled Yorktown. But later that afternoon, American dive bombers located and struck Hiryu as well. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the core of the Pearl Harbor strike force, were lost in a single day. The loss extended beyond hulls. Japan lost over 200 experienced naval aviators. Carrier-qualified pilots required extensive training measured in years. Replacement programs could not accelerate without eroding quality. Aircraft production in Japan lagged behind American capacity. By 1943, American factories would produce tens of thousands of aircraft annually, outpacing Japanese output significantly. At the human scale, a pilot standing on a carrier deck felt the vibration of engines through boots as aircraft launched. Sweat gathered under flight helmets in tropical heat. Anti-aircraft guns fired shells weighing over 20 pounds each into clear sky. Damage control crews fought fires with hoses that sputtered under ruptured lines. When flames reached ammunition stores, detonation followed. Japan lost the Battle of Midway not because its sailors lacked discipline or skill. It lost because operational complexity fractured timing. Intelligence advantages shifted unexpectedly. Aircraft rearming cycles collided with sudden attack. Industrial capacity favored the United States. Pilot attrition could not be replaced at equal pace. 4 carriers lost, represented not only 80,000 tons of steel, but concentrated expertise that could not be rebuilt quickly. The defeat stalled Japanese expansion. It eroded offensive capability in a way no prior setback had. From that point forward, Japan fought increasingly defensive battles against an adversary whose production curves climbed steadily. If you are listening as the evening settles, imagine those carrier decks at dawn. Aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip, mechanics tightening bolts, ordnance crews loading bombs. Then imagine the sudden eruption of fire and the long hours afterward when smoke drifted across open ocean. The battle turned in minutes, but its consequences stretched for years. Let that image drift with you as your breathing slows. This is the entire history of why Japan lost the Battle of Midway. Chapter 1. The Faulty Compass. How Naval Intelligence Became Japan's Achilles Heel. The 10th of May, 1942. Basement level, Administration Building, Pearl Harbor. The air smells of mimeograph fluid and cigarette smoke that's been recycling through inadequate ventilation for 6 months. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort sits at a metal desk with a water-stained decrypt in front of him. The paper is still damp from the developing process. In the upper right corner, someone has written in blue pencil, AF equals Midway. Confidence, 85%. The number is crossed out. Above it, in the same hand, a new figure, 90%. That small adjustment, 5 percentage points added by human intuition to mechanical probability, would determine the location of the largest naval battle in the Pacific War. The story of Midway begins not with aircraft carriers or admirals, but with a code that shouldn't have been broken and an enemy that couldn't believe it was broken. For 6 weeks before the first bomb fell, the battle was being fought in radio intercept stations and cryptographic basements. Station HYPO, the designation for Pearl Harbor's Signals Intelligence Unit, had been attacking Japanese naval code JN-25D since the previous autumn. By May of 1942, they'd achieved something the Japanese High Command considered mathematically impossible: partial reconstruction of a code system that used 2,800 separate code groups, each modified by random additives from a separate book. What fascinates me about the archival record here is not the American achievement, but the Japanese institutional response. Multiple signals officers noted irregularities in American radio behavior throughout April and May. They saw the patterns, they logged the concerns, and then, systematically, every warning was dismissed as defeatist thinking. Vice Admiral Motome Ugaki kept a diary throughout the war, one of the more remarkable primary sources we have from the Japanese side. His entry for the 15th of April contains a single sentence that I keep returning to. Our communications specialists express concern about enemy direction-finding activity, but this seems to me nothing more than the Americans fishing in waters too deep for their nets. The metaphor is telling. Ugaki was a brilliant strategist, a man who understood logistics and operational planning at the highest level, but he couldn't conceive that American cryptographers might be systematically reading his mail. The cognitive dissonance was structural, not personal. Japanese naval doctrine held that code security was a function of mathematical complexity. They'd built JN-25 around a two-stage encipherment process. First, plain language was converted to numerical code groups using a massive codebook. Then those groups were modified using random additives from a second book. The system was elegant. It was also, by May of 1942, approximately 60 to 70% compromised. The breakthrough came not from mathematical genius, but from operational necessity and a willingness to take intellectual risks. Commander Rochefort's team at Station HYPO worked in conditions that would horrify modern intelligence analysts. The basement had no windows. The ventilation was marginal. The men worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes 16, living on coffee and sandwiches brought down from the cafeteria above. They wore smoking jackets and slippers because Rochefort believed formality was the enemy of creative thinking. The walls were covered with massive sheets of paper, showing code groups, frequency patterns, and attempted reconstructions. It looked less like a military installation and more like a graduate seminar in mathematics that had spiraled into obsession. And in a sense, that's exactly what it was. These men were trying to reverse engineer a language they couldn't speak, using only the statistical shadows it left in radio traffic. The critical moment, the one that moves this from interesting code breaking to operational intelligence, came on the 19th of May. Station HYPO had been tracking an unusual volume of traffic related to something designated AF in the Japanese code. The analysts believed AF was Midway Atoll, a small American outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. But belief wasn't certainty. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, needed actionable intelligence, not educated guesses. So Rochefort proposed what intelligence historians now call the freshwater ruse. He had Midway's garrison send an uncoded radio message, reporting that their freshwater distillation equipment had broken down. The message went out on the 19th of May. 48 hours later, Station HYPO intercepted a Japanese decrypt stating, "AF reports shortage of fresh water." It was confirmation. It was also a remarkable piece of operational audacity, essentially tricking the enemy into confirming your cryptographic breakthrough by making them respond to bait. What strikes me as I work through the declassified traffic from this period is how fragile the American advantage actually was. Post-war histories often present Station HYPO's work as comprehensive, a clean break into enemy communications. The reality was messier and more partial. A National Security Agency review conducted in 2015 suggests that Rochefort's team could fully read perhaps 40% of intercepted messages, could partially reconstruct another 20 to 30%, and the remainder was opaque. Even the messages they could read often lacked context. A decrypt might say, "Carrier Division 1 will depart on the 27th," without specifying where they were departing from or where they were going. The analysts had to build a picture from fragments, cross-referencing new intercepts with older traffic, with diplomatic cables intercepted through a completely separate system called Purple, with submarine reconnaissance reports, with radio direction finding bearings. It was detective work, conducted in multiple languages, against a deadline that was counting down, whether they knew it or not. The Americans had one enormous advantage that had nothing to do with mathematics or code-breaking talent: institutional culture. When Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, presented the Midway theory, Nimitz asked him a question that appears in 3 different accounts with 3 slightly different wordings. The most commonly cited version is, "Are you willing to stake your career on this?" Layton's response was immediate, "Yes, sir." And Nimitz believed him, not because the evidence was perfect, it wasn't. Not because there was no risk of catastrophic error, there was enormous risk. But because the American command culture in the Pacific had learned to trust probabilistic thinking. They'd been surprised at Pearl Harbor. They'd been pushed back across the Pacific for 6 months. They were willing to act on incomplete information, because waiting for perfect information meant ceding the initiative forever. The Japanese, meanwhile, were trapped in a different institutional logic. On the 25th of May, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship received a final decrypt, confirming that Admiral Nagumo's carrier strike force would depart Japanese waters on the 27th of May. The decrypt arrived 6 hours after Nagumo had actually sailed. This should have been a catastrophic compromise. It meant American intelligence had the departure date before some of Yamamoto's own subordinate commanders did. But there's no evidence the Japanese even noticed the timing. Their operational security focused on preventing information from leaving Japanese communications networks. The possibility that Americans were already inside those networks, reading along in something close to real time, was institutionally unthinkable. I find this fascinating from a historical perspective, because it reveals how organizations can be defeated not by enemy strength, but by their own assumptions about what's possible. By the 1st of June, Nimitz had positioned his available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway. He knew, with reasonable certainty, where the Japanese fleet would approach from and approximately when they would arrive. The Japanese knew none of this. They believed their plans were secure. They believed the Americans had perhaps 1 carrier, maybe 2, somewhere in the South Pacific. They believed Midway would be a surprise attack against an unprepared garrison. All of these beliefs were false. All of them stemmed from a code security failure that began months earlier and was never acknowledged, never investigated, never corrected. Yamamoto was sailing into an ambush, and the only people who didn't know it were on his side. The water-stained decrypt that Rochefort annotated on the 10th of May sits now in the National Archives. I've seen photographs of it. The original is too fragile for regular handling. The blue pencil marks are still visible. 85% crossed out, 90% written above. It's tempting to see this as a historical artifact, a museum piece from a battle long concluded. But what it really represents is a decision point. Someone, Rochefort himself most likely, looked at the mathematical probability generated by his team's analysis and made a human judgment call to increase the confidence level. He added 5 percentage points based on intuition, experience, the feel of the intelligence picture, and he was right. That small act of intellectual courage, recorded in smudged blue pencil on damp paper, was the first shot fired in the Battle of Midway. The Japanese never saw it coming because they were certain it couldn't exist. Chapter 2. The Doctrine of the Decisive Battle, Mahanian Ghosts in the Machine. The spring of 1936, Naval War College, Tokyo. The lecture hall smells of floor wax and the salt air coming through open windows from Tokyo Bay. Captain Yasuji Watanabe stands at a podium, teaching the next generation of staff officers about the principles of decisive battle. On the blackboard behind him, he's drawn a diagram showing the Russian Baltic Fleet's approach to Tsushima Strait in 1905. The Russian ships are represented by rectangles. The Japanese fleet, under Admiral Togo, appears as a curved line intercepting them. Watanabe taps the diagram with his pointer. The fleet that attacks, he says, possesses the advantage, concentration of force at the decisive point. This is the foundation of all naval strategy. 30 students are taking notes. Among them are men who will, 6 years later, plan the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation. They are learning tactics for a war that hasn't happened yet, using lessons from a battle fought before most of them were born. What strikes me about Japanese naval doctrine in this period is how intellectually coherent it was and how completely unsuited to the war they would actually fight. The Japanese officer corps was steeped in the writings of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American naval theorist whose book The Influence of Sea Power Upon History had become something like scripture in naval colleges around the world. Mahan argued that wars were won by decisive fleet engagements, massive clashes of battleships that would establish control of the sea in a single afternoon. He used examples from the Age of Sail, Trafalgar, the Armada, the battles of the Anglo-Dutch Wars. His central thesis was that commerce raiding and guerre de course were distractions. Real naval power came from building a battle fleet capable of destroying the enemy's battle fleet in one climactic encounter. To the Japanese Navy of the 1930s, this made perfect sense. They had, after all, destroyed the Russian fleet at Tsushima in exactly this manner. One battle, overwhelming victory, control of the sea. The problem, and I find this is often underappreciated in popular histories, is that Mahan wrote his theories in 1890, before aircraft existed, before submarines were practical weapons, before radio communications could coordinate forces across thousands of miles. His framework assumed battles would be fought within visual range, with battleships as the primary weapons. By 1942, carrier aircraft had ranges of over 200 miles. Submarines could interdict supply lines across the entire Pacific. The nature of naval warfare had fundamentally changed, but Japanese doctrine hadn't caught up. Or rather, it had caught up tactically. They'd built excellent carriers, trained superb pilots, developed innovative tactics for carrier operations. But strategically, they were still thinking in Mahanian terms. They wanted the big decisive battle. They wanted to lure the American fleet into a single engagement and destroy it. Midway was conceived as exactly this, the trap that would force the Americans into the climactic confrontation that would win the war. I've spent time with Watanabe's lecture notes from that 1936 course. They're preserved in the Japanese National Institute for Defense Studies. What fascinates me is how often he returns to the concept of interior lines. This was a Mahanian idea. The side that could concentrate its forces faster had the advantage. Japan, positioned between American bases in Hawaii and the Philippines, had interior lines. They could move forces across shorter distances than the Americans, who had to cross the entire Pacific. This was true, as far as it went, but it assumed a kind of war, a chess game of fleet movements and decisive battles that was already becoming obsolete. The Americans were learning to fight differently, with logistics, with industrial production, with intelligence. They were fighting a war of attrition and resource management, not looking for a decisive Mahanian engagement. But Japan's entire strategic culture was oriented toward that one big battle. In December of 1941, after the Pearl Harbor attack, there's a staff meeting in Tokyo where Yamamoto's doubts about the decisive battle strategy are recorded in the minutes. He questions whether luring the American fleet into a single engagement is actually achievable. He notes that the Americans might not cooperate, might refuse the decisive battle, and instead pursue a strategy of gradual attrition. His concerns are acknowledged and then overruled. The consensus view among the naval general staff is that the Americans will have to defend Midway if attacked, and in defending it, they'll expose their carriers to destruction. It's classic Mahanian thinking: create conditions that force the enemy into the decisive engagement. What's missing from this analysis, and I find this gap revealing, is any serious consideration of what happens if the Americans have better intelligence, if they know the plan in advance, if they've already positioned their forces for the ambush rather than the defense. There's a source conflict here that historians continue to debate. Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack and was aboard Akagi at Midway, wrote extensively about these operations in the 1950s. He portrays Yamamoto as privately skeptical of the Midway plan, forced into it by an aggressive staff. But Watanabe, Yamamoto's operations officer, gave interviews in the 1960s where he insists Yamamoto authored the plan enthusiastically, that it was his idea from the start. Who's telling the truth? Or more precisely, who's protecting whom? Fuchida had every reason to rehabilitate Yamamoto's reputation. He was a national hero, after all. Watanabe had every reason to spread the responsibility, to suggest the plan had institutional backing. The documentary evidence doesn't settle this cleanly. What we know for certain is that by April of 1942, the Midway operation had been approved at the highest levels, and whatever doubts existed were suppressed in favor of operational momentum. The strangest moment in the planning process, and this is well documented from multiple sources, occurred during the war game exercise held in early May at Naval Staff Headquarters. These exercises were elaborate affairs. Officers moved ship models across large floor maps. Umpires calculated ranges, fuel consumption, likely damage from various weapons. It was a kind of analog simulation of the coming battle. During the Midway war game, the umpires determined that American carrier aircraft had scored hits on multiple Japanese carriers, sinking at least one. This result was inconvenient. It suggested the plan had serious flaws. So the senior umpire, a captain whose name appears in several accounts but whose motivations remain opaque, simply reversed the ruling. He declared the hits hadn't occurred, or had been less severe or something. The game continued. The Japanese won on paper, and nobody seriously questioned whether this was, perhaps, a warning signal that the plan needed revision. To me, the most telling detail isn't the reversal itself, but what it reveals about institutional culture. In American war games, surprising or unwelcome results were usually investigated. They'd rerun the scenario, examine the assumptions, try to understand why the simulation produced that outcome. The point was to find weaknesses before the actual battle. But in this case, the Japanese military culture prioritized consensus and forward momentum over critical analysis. Once a plan had high-level backing, questioning it became professionally risky. The war game was supposed to test the plan, but in practice, it became a ritual of validation. The outcome was predetermined. Japan would win the decisive battle. The exercise was just theater. There's one more piece of this puzzle that I think explains a great deal about why Midway unfolded as it did. On the 5th of May, Admiral Nagumo, who would command the carrier strike force, requested that all 6 available carriers be concentrated for the operation. This made tactical sense. More carriers meant more aircraft, better combat air patrol coverage, redundancy if one ship was damaged. But Yamamoto refused. He split the forces, sending 2 carriers north to the Aleutian Islands as part of a diversionary operation. His reasoning, documented in the operational orders, was that dividing American attention would increase the chances of surprise at Midway. This is Mahanian thinking again, deception and concentration at the decisive point. But it ignored a crucial factor that intelligence would have revealed had they been reading American communications. The Americans weren't going to be deceived. They knew Midway was the main target. The Aleutians operation wouldn't divert anything. It would just mean Japan was fighting with 4 carriers instead of 6. The doctrine of decisive battle had become a trap. It promised that one perfect operation, one climactic engagement, could change the course of the war. This was emotionally compelling, especially for a nation that knew, even if it wouldn't admit publicly, that it couldn't win a long war of attrition against American industrial power. The decisive battle offered hope. It offered a path to victory through brilliance and daring, rather than through tonnage and production capacity. But hope isn't strategy, and by June of 1942, Japan was sailing toward Midway with a plan that was intellectually elegant, tactically sophisticated, and strategically incoherent. They were fighting the ghost of Tsushima. The Americans, unknown to them, were fighting a completely different war. Chapter 3. The Arithmetic of Arrogance, Material Inferiority as Strategy. February of 1942. Navy Ministry, Tokyo. Lieutenant Shigeru Fukudome sits in a windowless office, reviewing production schedules and raw material allocations. His job is not glamorous. He doesn't command ships or plan operations. He tracks numbers: steel tonnage, aluminum ingots, aviation fuel reserves, merchant shipping capacity. On his desk is a classified report he's been compiling for the past 6 weeks. Page 47 contains a hand-drawn graph comparing Japanese and American industrial output. The Japanese line rises slowly, then plateaus around mid-1942. The American line goes nearly vertical. Someone, Fukudome himself perhaps, has marked a small X on the graph at June 1942 with a notation in the margin: critical month. It's not immediately clear what he means by this. Perhaps it's the last moment when Japan's current naval strength gives them approximate parity. Perhaps it's when the math becomes undeniable. Either way, the graph tells a story that the battles will later confirm. The war Japan was fighting was, from the start, a war against arithmetic. This isn't hindsight or historical judgment. Japanese planners knew it at the time. They'd run the numbers. They understood that America's gross national product was roughly 8 to 10 times larger than Japan's. They knew American steel production exceeded Japanese production by a factor of 7 or 8 to 1. They knew the United States had petroleum reserves measured in billions of barrels, while Japan had to import virtually every drop of oil it consumed. The question wasn't whether these numbers existed. They did, and they were undeniable. The question was whether operational brilliance could overcome material inferiority, whether a shorter, decisive war could be won before the American industrial machine fully mobilized. This was the gamble, and by February of 1942, the window was already closing. Let me give you some specific figures, because I think the scale of the disparity is often underappreciated. In 1942, Japan's total warship construction capacity was approximately 187,000 tons per year. This included everything: battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers. The United States, in that same year, could produce 1.8 million tons. That's not a marginal advantage. That's 9.6 to 1. It means that for every ship Japan built, America built nearly 10. And this ratio was improving in America's favor as new shipyards came online, and existing yards optimized their processes. The Essex-class carrier program is a perfect illustration. In early 1942, the U.S. Navy ordered 4 Essex-class carriers. By March, they'd increased the order to 12. Japan couldn't have built 12 fleet carriers if they'd had 10 years. They didn't have the steel, the aluminum, the skilled labor, or the industrial infrastructure. The Americans were building them on an assembly line model, launching a new one every 6 to 8 weeks by mid-1943. Aircraft production shows the same pattern, but more dramatically because the numbers are larger and the attrition rates were higher. In April of 1942, Nakajima Aircraft Company, Japan's largest producer, built 180 Zero fighters. This was actually good production for them, close to their maximum capacity. The problem was that Navy calculations suggested they needed 250 aircraft per month just to maintain current force levels given expected combat losses. They were already in a deficit, and the war was only 5 months old. American production in the same month was over 2,000 aircraft of all types, with roughly 425 of those being carrier-capable fighters and dive bombers. The gap wasn't just in quantity, but in industrial flexibility. American factories could retool, could increase production, could bring new facilities online. Japanese production was essentially fixed at 1941 levels because there was no slack in the system, no unused capacity, no reserve of raw materials to expand into. The pilot training numbers are equally stark and more consequential in the long term. In May of 1942, Japan graduated approximately 100 new carrier-qualified pilots from its training schools. These men had, on average, between 250 and 300 hours of flight time. The quality was high, the standards rigorous, but the throughput was limited by fuel availability, by the number of training aircraft, by the number of experienced instructors. The United States, in that same month, graduated 425 new naval aviators. Their average flight time was slightly lower, around 250 hours, but the volume was overwhelming, and American training could scale. They had petroleum reserves to burn aviation fuel by the thousands of gallons. They had manufacturing capacity to build training aircraft that would never see combat. Japan had neither. What fascinates me as I work through Fukudome's economic assessments is how clearly Japanese planners understood all of this. This wasn't secret information. The data was available. Multiple officers wrote reports and memos outlining the production gap, and yet the operational planning proceeded as if the numbers didn't matter, or as if they could be overcome through superior tactics and fighting spirit. There's a cognitive dissonance here that's hard to fully explain. Part of it was cultural, an emphasis on will and morale over material factors. Part of it was strategic desperation. If you can't win the long war, you have to try for the short one. But part of it, I think, was simple organizational momentum. By early 1942, Japan was committed. They'd attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered Southeast Asia, seized the Dutch East Indies oil fields. The only path forward was through to some kind of favorable settlement before American industry made continued resistance mathematically impossible. The oil situation deserves particular attention because it was both the cause of the war and the constraint on how it could be fought. Japan's entire strategic position in late 1941 rested on access to petroleum. The American oil embargo had forced their hand. Either seize the Dutch East Indies fields or watch the Navy and Air Force grind to a halt within months. They'd seized the fields. They'd secured the oil. But there was a 6-month lag between conquest and usable production. The oil had to be pumped, refined, transported thousands of miles through submarine-infested waters, and distributed to where it was needed. Official Japanese histories claim they had adequate oil reserves for 2 years of combat operations. Allied intelligence assessments, based on decoded shipping manifests and tanker movements, suggested 14 months. That's a significant discrepancy. If the Americans were right, then by mid-1943, the Imperial Navy would be facing fuel shortages that would limit operational tempo. Every sortie, every training exercise, every redeployment consumed irreplaceable petroleum. The clock was ticking. There's one more material factor that I think gets overlooked in traditional battle narratives: the salvage and recycling economy that Japan was forced into almost immediately. By mid-1942, 12% of Japan's specialty steel alloys were coming not from mines or smelters, but from battlefield salvage. Destroyed ships were cut apart, and the metal recycled. Captured equipment was melted down. Chromium, in particular, was in desperately short supply. It was essential for hardening steel, especially armor plate and gun barrels. Japan had limited domestic chromium deposits and had relied on imports from places like the Philippines and Malaya. They had those sources now, but getting the raw ore back to Japan, processing it, and distributing it to steel mills took time and shipping capacity that was also needed for oil, food, ammunition, and replacement parts. Every ton of cargo space was a zero-sum calculation. Move chromium ore or move aviation fuel. Both were essential, both were in deficit. When I look at the Midway operation through this economic lens, it takes on a different character. It's not just a tactical gamble to lure the American carriers into a trap. It's an attempt to buy time by destroying American naval capacity faster than it can be replaced. If Japan could sink 3 or 4 American carriers at Midway, that would set back American offensive capability by perhaps 6 to 9 months. Enough time, maybe, to consolidate defenses, to bring new resources into production, to force the Americans into negotiating some kind of settlement. But this strategy had a fundamental flaw. It assumed American production would remain static. It assumed the Americans couldn't or wouldn't accelerate their building programs. And it assumed that Japan could sustain its own force levels through combat and attrition. All 3 assumptions were wrong. American shipyards were already expanding. The production curves were going exponential. And Japan's ability to replace losses, ships, aircraft, and especially trained pilots, was limited by math, not morale. The final figure I want to leave you with, because I think it crystallizes the entire strategic picture, is this. Japan's total naval construction capacity, expressed in tons, was roughly equal to the capacity of 2 American shipyards. Not 2 companies, 2 individual yards. The Japanese Empire, with all its resources, all its industry, could match the output of Bath Iron Works in Maine and Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia. And the United States had dozens of yards. The arithmetic wasn't forgiving. It wasn't even close. And by June of 1942, the critical month marked on Fukudome's graph, the window for decisive battle, for changing the strategic calculation through operational brilliance, was already beginning to close. Chapter 4. The Scout Plane That Changed Everything. Mechanical Failure as Historical Actor. The 4th of June, 1942. 04:15 hours. The heavy cruiser Tone pitches slightly in a low swell somewhere northwest of Midway Atoll. Petty Officer First Class Norifumi Takahashi stands on the catapult deck aft of the ship's No. 3 turret. He's holding a pressure gauge. The dial reads 82 kilograms per square centimeter. Nominal pressure for the Kure Type 1 Model 2 catapult is 95. Takahashi has been maintaining this equipment for 18 months. He knows the margins. 82 is marginal, not unsafe exactly, not technically out of spec, but marginal. He makes a notation in maintenance log 127. Catapult No. 3 hydraulic accumulator showing 82 kilograms pressure. Delay launch until inspection complete. The ink is slightly smudged. Perhaps his hands are damp from the sea air. Perhaps he's rushing. He doesn't know it yet, but this decision to delay one aircraft launch by approximately 30 minutes for a hydraulic inspection will cost Japan 3 aircraft carriers. The Kure Type 1 catapult was a sophisticated piece of machinery, at least by 1942 standards. It used a hydraulic accumulator system to build up pressure, then release that pressure rapidly to accelerate a float plane from 0 to flight speed in roughly 40 feet of deck. The system worked well when properly maintained. The problem was that maintenance at sea is never perfect. Seals wear, pressure drops, and in the cold waters of the North Pacific in early June, hydraulic fluid doesn't behave quite the same as it does in the warm testing tanks back at Kure Naval Arsenal, where the system was designed. Takahashi is seeing a 6.4% pressure loss, not catastrophic, but enough to make him pause. The decision tree he faces is straightforward in theory, complicated in practice. He can recommend immediate launch at degraded pressure. The catapult will probably work. Probably. Or he can recommend delay for a full diagnostic, which will take time but ensure the system is safe. He's a maintenance specialist, not a tactical officer. His job is equipment reliability, not operational tempo. He chooses caution. He recommends delay. Chief Warrant Officer Kato, who commands the catapult deck, agrees. This is peacetime thinking applied in wartime. It's the correct engineering decision. It's also, in hindsight, potentially the most consequential maintenance choice of the entire Pacific War. At 04:45 hours, 30 minutes behind schedule, the Tone's No. 4 scout plane finally launches. Ensign Amari is at the controls. He's a competent pilot, experienced in reconnaissance work, meticulous about search patterns. He doesn't know he's late. He doesn't know that in the original flight schedule, he should have been airborne at 04:30. He doesn't know that those 15 minutes, actually closer to 30 by the time the catapult inspection is complete and the aircraft prepared, will put him in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. He banks to his assigned search sector and begins his methodical sweep of empty ocean. What I find remarkable about this incident is how the documentation survived. Takahashi's maintenance log was recovered from Tone's records after the war. It's not glamorous material, it's engineering paperwork. Pressure readings, component serial numbers, inspection schedules. But it's also a precise record of the mechanical reality that underlies all military operations. Ships are machines. Machines wear out, seals leak, and sometimes a 3-liter hydraulic fluid loss, that's roughly 6.4% of the accumulator's 47-liter capacity, changes the course of history. The hydraulic seal that failed was repairable. Tone carried replacement seals in inventory. Installing a new seal would have taken approximately 90 minutes if they'd started the night before. Nobody made that call. Perhaps because 82 kilograms was still within acceptable tolerances. Perhaps because the maintenance schedule was already compressed by operational tempo. Perhaps because in 18 months of combat operations, the catapult had never failed critically. It's impossible to say now. What we know is that the decision was made in the moment based on the information available, and it seemed reasonable at the time. At 0730 hours, Ensign Amari's radio message arrives on tone. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The message is maddeningly vague. 10 ships could mean a supply convoy, could mean cruisers, could mean carriers. Amari doesn't specify. Standard procedure would be to close for visual identification, but he's at the edge of his fuel range. He has to choose. Investigate further and risk running out of fuel on the return flight, or report now and maintain fuel margin. He reports now. The vagueness of his message will compound the problems caused by his late launch. The timing of this message is almost perfectly calculated to create maximum disruption. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai carrier force, is at this exact moment recovering aircraft from the first strike on Midway Island. His flight decks are full of landing aircraft. His hangars are full of aircraft being rearmed for a potential second strike on Midway. He has, for the past 45 minutes, been operating under the assumption that there are no American carriers within 200 miles. Amari's message destroys that assumption, but it doesn't provide enough information to act on. Are there carriers in that force? If so, how many? Where exactly are they? Nagumo needs answers. He orders Amari to investigate further, but Amari is too far away. The answers will take time that Nagumo doesn't have. There's a source conflict here worth noting. Takahashi, in a 1958 interview, claimed he recommended immediate launch despite the pressure loss, that it was Chief Warrant Officer Kato who insisted on the delay. His maintenance log, written in real time, suggests the opposite, that Takahashi himself recommended the inspection. Memory is a fragile thing, especially when you're remembering a decision that contributed to national catastrophe. It's entirely possible Takahashi's memory simply rewrote the event in a psychologically more comfortable way. Or perhaps his interview was edited or mistranslated. The written record, created in the moment without knowledge of what would follow, seems more reliable to me. But the conflict itself is revealing. It shows how even participants in historical events aren't always reliable narrators of their own actions. I keep returning to that pressure reading, 82 kilograms. I've read technical manuals for the Kure Type 1 catapult. I've talked to naval engineers who work with similar systems. The consensus is that 82 kilograms was probably safe for launch. Not ideal, but safe. The decision to delay was overcautious, especially in a combat situation where time matters. But here's the thing. Takahashi didn't know it was a combat situation where time mattered. As far as he knew, this was a routine reconnaissance launch for an operation that would unfold over several days. The importance of those 30 minutes wasn't apparent at 0415. It only became apparent at 0730, when Amari's delayed sighting report arrived at the worst possible moment in Nagumo's decision cycle. This is what I mean when I say mechanical failures are historical actors. It's not that the hydraulic seal had agency or intention. It's that the physical reality of worn equipment interacts with human decisions in ways that shape outcomes. If that seal had been replaced the night before, Amari launches on time. If Amari launches on time, he reaches his search sector 30 minutes earlier. If he reaches his sector 30 minutes earlier, he spots the American carriers at approximately 0700 hours instead of 0730. That half-hour difference means his sighting report arrives while Nagumo's flight decks are still clear, while the first Midway strike is still in the air, before the critical moment when the decision to rearm for land attack versus anti-ship attack becomes operationally binding. Would earlier warning have changed the outcome? Possibly. Probably, even. We can't know for certain, but the possibility haunts the historical record like a ghost made of hydraulic fluid and worn rubber seals. Chapter 5. The Kido Butai's Fatal Doctrine, Why Elite Units Lose. Hashirajima Anchorage, late May, 1942. The carrier Akagi swings at anchor in calm water. Below decks, in the Air Operations Office, Commander Minoru Genda sits at a desk reviewing training scores. Genda is 38 years old. He's been thinking about carrier aviation tactics since the early 1930s. He essentially wrote the tactical manual for coordinated carrier strikes. His concepts were validated spectacularly at Pearl Harbor, then again at Darwin, Ceylon, and half a dozen smaller operations. Over 14 months of combat, the Kido Butai has sunk 47 Allied ships without losing a single carrier. This success is not accidental. It's the product of rigorous training, innovative tactics, and an operational culture that prioritizes aggressive offensive action above all else. Genda has created, in effect, the most lethal naval strike force in the world, and in doing so, he's built an institution that cannot adapt to defensive thinking. In Genda's personal tactical notebook, recovered from Akagi's wreckage in 1999 during a deep-sea expedition, there's a page that summarizes his philosophy. Page 23. The handwriting is precise, almost architectural. It reads, "The first strike determines the battle. The side that masses aircraft first wins." Below this, he's drawn a simple diagram showing a carrier launching aircraft while the enemy's carriers are still spotted on deck. There are no addendums, no contingencies, no consideration of what happens if the enemy strikes first. The doctrine is pure offense, and for 14 months, it's worked perfectly. What fascinates me about this document is what it doesn't contain. There's no discussion of defensive tactics, no consideration of how to fight while under attack, how to maintain combat air patrol coverage during rearmament operations, how to coordinate damage control while launching aircraft. These aren't oversights, they're philosophical positions. Genda believed, and the Kido Butai's combat record supported his belief, that the side that attacked first would win. Defense was something you did when you'd already lost the initiative. The way to win was to maintain initiative through relentless offensive action. This wasn't recklessness, it was doctrine, developed through years of careful thought and validated by consistent success. The problem with this approach is that it creates institutional blind spots. When every training exercise, every war game, every after-action review focuses on improving offensive striking power, you don't develop the muscle memory for defensive operations. A specific example. In May of 1942, Commander Genda observed a squadron conducting a training exercise off Kyushu. The squadron commander had maintained a strong combat air patrol overhead, keeping reserve fighters ready to intercept incoming strikes. Genda critiqued this as defensive thinking. He argued that those fighters should have been included in the strike package to maximize hitting power. He wasn't wrong in his logic. More aircraft in the strike does mean more damage to the enemy. But he also wasn't preparing his force for the possibility that they might be the ones receiving the strike, not delivering it. There's a source conflict worth examining here. Mitsuo Fuchida's post-war memoir claims that Admiral Nagumo resisted Genda's aggressive tactics, that he wanted more conservative operations with stronger defensive measures. Genda's diary suggests the opposite, that Nagumo fully endorsed the offensive doctrine, and sometimes pushed for even more aggressive action than Genda recommended. Who's telling the truth? Probably both, in different contexts. Fuchida was writing after the war, when Nagumo's reputation needed rehabilitation. He had incentive to portray Nagumo as cautious and prudent, the careful senior officer reined in by aggressive subordinates. Genda's diary, written contemporaneously, had no such agenda, but neither source is completely objective. What we can say with confidence is that by June of 1942, the Kido Butai's operational culture was thoroughly committed to offensive action as the primary, perhaps only, path to victory. The doctrine showed its weakness on the morning of June 4th, during a critical decision point. At 0715 hours, Admiral Nagumo faced a choice about rearming his second strike wave. The aircraft were currently armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship work. Genda's doctrine said to maintain that loadout, keep the strike ready for whatever enemy carriers might appear. But reports from the first Midway strike suggested another attack on the island would be necessary to suppress its air defenses. The choice was rearm for land attack and maximize damage to Midway, or maintain anti-ship loadout for a threat that might not exist. Genda wasn't in the operations room to weigh in. He was below decks, running a fever, possibly influenza. His absence at this critical moment is one of those historical details that feels almost too convenient. Was he really sick? Or did he, on some level, sense the operation was heading toward disaster and create psychological distance from it? I don't think we can know. What we know is that without Genda's voice in the room, the decision was made to rearm for land attack. This is where doctrine becomes fatal. Rearming from torpedoes to bombs wasn't a simple process. The Type 91 torpedo weighed roughly 1,800 pounds. The Type 99 bomb weighed 550 pounds for the standard model, more for armor-piercing variants. The weapons themselves had to be physically removed from the aircraft, brought down to the magazines, stored, and different weapons brought up and mounted. With the Kido Butai's practiced crew, this could be done in about 90 minutes if everything went smoothly. But it required moving aircraft between the flight deck and the hangar deck in a precisely choreographed sequence. The flight deck had to be clear enough to spot aircraft for takeoff, but also accommodate the aircraft being rearmed. It was complex, it was time-consuming, and it was based on the assumption that they had time, that no enemy strike was inbound, that the American carriers, if they existed, were too far away to be an immediate threat. The assumption was wrong. At approximately 0900 hours, while rearming was underway, reports started coming in about American torpedo bombers attacking the fleet. The attack was ineffective. Most of the American planes were shot down, but it disrupted the rearming operation. Aircraft had to be respotted, the schedule slipped, and critically, the defensive assumption had been shattered. There were American carriers within strike range, but by this point, the rearming operation was too far advanced to reverse. The aircraft were caught in transition, armed for neither land attack nor anti-ship attack, just partially armed with bombs and torpedoes, scattered between the flight deck, hangar deck, and magazines. It was the worst of all possible positions, and it was a direct result of offensive doctrine that didn't account for the possibility of being caught in transition. To me, the most damning detail isn't the specific tactical choices, but the training culture that made those choices seem reasonable. The Kido Butai conducted 0 training exercises for rearming under attack scenarios, not because they'd forgotten about it, not because they didn't have time, but because such exercises were considered defeatist thinking. The implicit assumption was that they would never be caught in that situation. They would strike first. The enemy would be reacting to them, not the other way around. This is what success does to elite units. It creates a set of assumptions about how battles will unfold, and those assumptions become so deeply embedded that questioning them feels like disloyalty or cowardice. The Kido Butai had spent 14 months proving that attacking first was the path to victory. They'd internalized this lesson so thoroughly that they couldn't imagine a battle where it didn't apply. The irony is that Genda himself was brilliant enough to have seen the problem. His pre-war writings show a sophisticated understanding of risk and uncertainty in naval operations. But by 1942, his own success had trapped him. The tactical system he'd created worked so well that there was no institutional pressure to develop alternatives. And when that system finally encountered a scenario it wasn't designed for, a well-planned American ambush, executed with good intelligence and some operational luck, it had no backup plan. The doctrine that had made them unbeatable for 14 months made them vulnerable the moment the assumptions underlying that doctrine proved false. Excellence had become rigidity, and rigidity in combat is eventually fatal. Chapter 6. The Radar Gap, Fighting in Different Centuries. The 4th of June, 1942, 0553 hours, USS Enterprise, somewhere northeast of Midway. Ensign Jack Blitch sits in the ship's Combat Information Center, watching a circular screen glow green in the darkness. The screen shows a planned position indicator, a radar plot. Bright dots appear as the antenna rotates. Most of the dots are friendly ships in the task force, but there, at the edge of the screen, bearing 270 degrees, distance 93 miles, is a cluster of dots that shouldn't be there. Blitch makes a notation on his plot sheet. Multiple bogies bearing 270, distance 93 miles, altitude estimated 12,000 feet. The timestamp reads 0553. It will be another 14 minutes before the first Japanese aircraft is spotted visually by any ship in the task force. 14 minutes, when the Americans know exactly where the enemy is, and the enemy has no idea they've been detected. This is the radar gap, and it's not a marginal advantage. It's a category difference between fighting in 1942 and fighting as if it's still 1936. The story of radar in the Pacific War is not primarily a story of invention. Both sides had developed radio detection systems by the late 1930s, but of institutional commitment. The British had invented the cavity magnetron in 1940, a device that enabled centimetric radar with far better resolution than the meter wave systems used previously. They shared this technology with the United States in one of the great intelligence coups of the war. American industry took the cavity magnetron and scaled it. By mid-1942, the U.S. Navy had deployed CXAM-1 radar sets on multiple carriers and cruisers. These systems could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles in good conditions. They weren't perfect. Weather could degrade performance. The technology was new enough that operators were still learning its capabilities. But it worked. It gave American task force commanders situational awareness that was simply impossible without it. Japan had radar. This is important to understand. It's not that Japanese scientists were incapable of developing the technology. They built working radar sets in the late 1930s. The problem was institutional priority. The Imperial Japanese Navy tested radar, found it unreliable in certain conditions, and made a cultural judgment that it was somehow unsporting or unmanly to rely on electronic detection rather than the trained eyes of experienced lookouts. There's a broader pattern here about how different militaries assess new technology. Some innovations get adopted eagerly, others get resisted, not because they don't work, but because they conflict with existing culture. Radar, in the Japanese Navy, conflicted with a culture that valued the human skill of the lookout, the officer trained to detect distant masks on the horizon through binoculars. That skill was hard-won. It took years to develop. Radar, by contrast, let any competent technician achieve better results by reading a screen. It democratized detection, and that was, in a sense, threatening to the established order. The technical specifications are revealing. The CXAM-1 radar aboard Enterprise weighed 15,400 pounds. Its rotating antenna drew 40 kilowatts of electrical power, equivalent to roughly 50 homes. It required a dedicated crew of trained operators and maintenance technicians. It was complex, expensive, and required significant shipboard space. But it could detect a formation of aircraft at 90 miles and track them continuously as they approached. This gave the task force commander time. Time to launch additional fighters, time to position his ships, time to prepare gun crews. In a carrier battle, where reaction time often determines outcome, that advance warning was transformative. Let me give you a specific example of how this played out at Midway. At 05:53 hours, Blitz detects the incoming Japanese strike on radar. The information goes immediately to Enterprise's fighter director. Fighters are already airborne on routine combat air patrol, but now they can be directed with precision. They're vectored to intercept at bearing 270, altitude 12,000 feet. The interception isn't perfect. Radar-directed combat air patrol was still a developing art in mid-1942, but it's vastly better than random patrol. The American fighters make contact with the Japanese formation, roughly 50 miles from the task force. They can't stop the strike. They don't shoot down enough aircraft to blunt the attack, but they disrupt the formation. They force the Japanese bombers to take evasive action, and they confirm that the enemy is where the radar said they would be. The technology works. Now consider the Japanese side. They have no shipborne radar on any of the Kido Butai carriers. Their first warning of incoming American aircraft comes from visual sighting by lookouts. The sky is partly cloudy. Visibility is variable. The lookouts are skilled, but they're human. They can't see through clouds. They can't detect aircraft at 70 or 80 miles. Their effective range is perhaps 10 to 15 miles under good conditions, less if the attacking aircraft use cloud cover effectively. This means the Japanese have, at best, 5 to 10 minutes warning before an attack arrives. Not enough time to launch additional fighters, barely enough time to alert gun crews and try to maneuver. The Americans are fighting with a 10-to-1 time advantage in detection range. That's not a technological edge. That's a different category of capability. There's a strange epilogue to this that I find revealing. In January of 1942, Japanese forces captured a B-17 bomber in the Philippines. The aircraft had an SCR-268 radar set installed. Japanese intelligence brought the equipment back to Tokyo. It sat in a Navy technical facility for several months. Nobody seriously examined it because it was Army equipment. An inter-service rivalry in Japan was so severe that the Navy wouldn't lower itself to study Army technology, even if that technology came from the enemy. By the time the Navy finally requested a technical evaluation, the radar set had been disassembled and partially destroyed by overeager technicians who didn't understand what they were looking at. This isn't just bureaucratic incompetence, it's institutional dysfunction on a level that defies easy explanation. The Japanese Navy had physical evidence of American radar capability in their hands, and chose not to learn from it because of pride and parochialism. What strikes me as I review the radar logs from Midway is how matter-of-fact they are. Blitch's entries are routine, professional, unexcited. Multiple bogeys bearing 270. Contact fading at 0615. He's doing his job. He doesn't know he's operating a technology that gives his side a fundamental advantage. Or perhaps he does know, in an abstract way, but it's normal to him. This is how battles are fought in 1942. You track the enemy on radar, you vector fighters, you maintain situational awareness through electronics. The Japanese, meanwhile, are scanning the horizon with binoculars and hoping their lookouts spot the enemy in time. It's not incompetence. It's not even really a failure of imagination. It's institutional inertia combined with cultural resistance to change. And against an enemy who's fully embraced the new technology, it's eventually fatal. The final piece of this puzzle involves radio homing, which is related to but distinct from radar. American dive bombers carried YE-ZB homing equipment that let them navigate back to their carriers by following radio signals. The system was simple. The carrier transmitted a directional signal on a rotating antenna. Aircraft could receive this signal and determine which direction to fly to reach home. In cloudy conditions, or after a long flight when fuel was low and navigation uncertain, this was life-saving technology. Japan had no equivalent system. Their pilots navigated by dead reckoning and hoped they could find their carriers visually. If weather was bad, if visibility was poor, if they were even slightly off in their calculations, they could fly past their carriers and run out of fuel over empty ocean. The Americans, by contrast, could find their way home through cloud cover, at night, in bad weather. This didn't matter much at Midway specifically. The weather was reasonably good on June 4th. But it illustrates a broader pattern. The Americans were building redundancy and technological assistance into every aspect of carrier operations. The Japanese were relying on human skill and hoping that would be sufficient. By mid-1942, it wasn't sufficient anymore. The radar gap was just one component of a larger technological divergence, but it was emblematic. Two navies, nominally fighting the same war, were operating with fundamentally different sensor capabilities. One could see 100 miles. The other could see 15. One had advance warning measured in tens of minutes. The other had warning measured in minutes or seconds. And in carrier battles where timing is everything, where launching 6 minutes earlier or later can determine whether your strike finds enemy flight decks full of vulnerable aircraft or already launched and empty, that gap was decisive. The Japanese at Midway were fighting blind. They didn't know it because they'd always fought this way, but the Americans could see. And that made all the difference. Chapter 7. The Aleutians. Distraction. Divided forces, divided defeat. The 1st of June, 1942. Aboard the carrier Junyo, steaming north toward the Aleutian Islands. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta sits in his cabin writing a letter to his wife. The letter won't be sent. Operational security forbids personal mail once the fleet is underway. But writing helps him think. He writes, "We steam north while the main force heads east. I am told this is deception, but I wonder who we are deceiving, the Americans or ourselves." The letter is censored, naturally, but it survived in his personal effects. It's a remarkable admission. Kakuta is openly questioning the strategic logic of his own mission, and he's right to question it. The Aleutians operation is, at best, a strategic distraction. At worst, it's a catastrophic division of forces that will leave Admiral Nagumo fighting with 4 carriers when he could have had 6. The Aleutians campaign made sense on paper. At least, it made sense if you accepted certain assumptions. The theory was that a Japanese attack on Alaskan territory would force the Americans to divert forces northward, weakening their defense of Midway. The Japanese would occupy Attu and Kiska Islands, barren, fog-shrouded rocks in the western Aleutians, establishing forward bases that could theoretically threaten the American west coast. The operation would also serve as the northern prong of a pincer, creating strategic ambiguity about Japanese intentions. The Americans would have to guess, is Midway the real target, or the Aleutians, or both? This logic assumed the Americans were operating on imperfect information, that they'd have to split their forces to cover multiple threats. But that assumption was wrong. Station HYPO's Codebreakers had already told Nimitz that Midway was the primary objective. The Aleutians operation wasn't going to deceive anyone. It was just going to divide Japanese carrier strength. Let me give you the specific force allocation, because the numbers make the problem clear. The Aleutians force comprised 2 fleet carriers, Junyo and Ryujo. Combined displacement, 35,800 tons. Combined aircraft capacity, roughly 120 aircraft. These were meaningful assets, second-line carriers perhaps, not as capable as the Kido Butai's heavyweights, but still valuable. Meanwhile, Admiral Nagumo was taking 4 carriers to Midway: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Combined aircraft, approximately 248. Now imagine if Nagumo had all 6 carriers concentrated in one force. Total aircraft, nearly 370. That's a 50% increase in strike power. More importantly, it's a 50% increase in defensive coverage. Combat air patrol could be maintained at higher density. Strikes could be larger and more devastating. Losses could be absorbed without crippling the force. This is basic mathematics, concentration of force. But the operation wasn't planned around basic mathematics. It was planned around multiple objectives that conflicted with each other. Yamamoto wanted to occupy the Aleutians. He wanted to destroy American carriers at Midway. He wanted to create strategic ambiguity. He wanted to force the Americans into a decisive battle on Japanese terms. These goals weren't necessarily compatible, especially when resources were limited. The decision to split forces reflected a kind of strategic maximalism, trying to achieve everything everywhere, rather than concentrating on the most important objective, and accepting that other goals would have to wait. There's a source conflict in the historical record about what the Aleutians operation was really for. Yamamoto's official operations plan presents it as a deception, a feint to draw American attention away from Midway. But Yamamoto's diary entry from April 20th describes it as a territorial acquisition that would establish permanent Japanese presence in North America. Which was it? Deception or conquest? The answer probably depends on when you asked and who you asked. Different officers involved in the planning had different understandings of the mission. This kind of strategic ambiguity is common in complex military operations, but it's also a warning sign. When the purpose of an operation isn't clearly defined, when different leaders have different understandings of what they're trying to achieve, that's usually an indication that the planning process has been driven by compromise and consensus building rather than clear strategic thinking. On June 3rd and 4th, while Nagumo is fighting for his life at Midway, Kakuta's carriers are striking Dutch harbor in the Aleutians. They launch 120 aircraft and damage some port facilities. It's a competent tactical operation, but it's also strategically irrelevant. The strikes on Dutch harbor aren't diverting any American forces from Midway. They aren't changing the strategic calculus. They're just creating a second battlefield 1,200 miles away, where Japanese carrier aircraft are being expended on targets that don't matter. And critically, those carriers are too far away to help at Midway, even if they receive emergency orders to turn south. The fuel consumption mathematics don't work. By the time Kakuta could transit to Midway's vicinity, the battle will be over. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 aboard Hiryu, understood this. On June 4th afternoon, after 3 of Nagumo's carriers had been hit and were burning, Yamaguchi sent a message to Yamamoto, requesting that the Aleutians force be ordered south at maximum speed. Yamamoto considered it. But the numbers didn't work. The Aleutians carriers were approximately 18 hours away at flank speed. Fuel consumption at that speed would be enormous. They'd arrive with depleted bunkers, unable to conduct sustained operations. And 18 hours was too late anyway. By the time they arrived, the battle would be decided one way or another. Yamamoto declined to order them south. This was the correct decision, given the circumstances. But it highlights the fundamental problem. The forces were divided in a way that made mutual support impossible. When Nagumo needed help, help existed but was out of reach. The aftermath of the Aleutians operation is almost farcical if it weren't so tragic. Japan did occupy Attu and Kiska. They landed troops. They established garrisons. For 15 months, they maintained a presence on these islands, which required a constant stream of supply ships running through some of the worst weather in the North Pacific. The strategic value of these bases was approximately 0. They couldn't support offensive operations against the American mainland. Too far, too isolated, too weather-bound. They couldn't interdict American shipping lanes, wrong position. They were just there, consuming resources, tying down garrison troops, requiring naval escorts for supply runs. The Americans eventually retook the islands in mid-1943. It was a difficult campaign. The terrain and weather were brutal, but it was never strategically crucial. The Japanese evacuated Kiska before the Americans arrived. Attu was defended, and the garrison fought to the last man. But their deaths didn't change anything. They died defending a rock in the fog that never should have been occupied in the first place. When I look at the Aleutians operation through the lens of what happened at Midway, what strikes me is the mathematical clarity of the mistake. If Kakuda's 2 carriers had been with Nagumo on June 4th, the combat air patrol over the Kido Butai would have been denser. There would have been more fighters to intercept American strikes. The force would have had more resilience. Losing 1 or 2 carriers wouldn't have been immediately catastrophic, because 4 would still remain. Would this have changed the outcome? Impossible to know with certainty. The Americans still had better intelligence. They still knew where the Japanese were and when they'd arrive. But 6 carriers versus 3 is different mathematics than 4 carriers versus 3. The margin for error is larger. The ability to absorb damage and continue fighting is greater. And in a battle that was decided by narrow margins, by the timing of scout plane launches, by whether aircraft were spotted on deck when the bombs fell, those margins might have mattered. The Aleutians operation is a case study in strategic incoherence. It was planned to achieve multiple goals. It achieved none of them well. It didn't deceive the Americans. It didn't materially threaten Alaska. It didn't draw off American forces from Midway. What it did do was ensure that Japan fought the decisive battle with 66% of their available carrier strength instead of 100%. In a war where Japan's margin for error was already razor thin, where they needed every advantage to offset American material superiority, that was a choice they couldn't afford to make. But they made it anyway, because the planning process valued doing something in multiple places over doing everything possible in the place that mattered most. Chapter 8. The First Contact. American Courage, American Futility. The 4th of June, 1942, 0920 hours. Torpedo Squadron 8 approaches the Japanese carrier fleet from the southwest. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron leads 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers in a loose formation about 50 feet above the water. There are no fighter escorts. The fighters lost contact somewhere during the transit. Waldron's pilots are alone, flying obsolete aircraft at barely over 100 knots toward the most concentrated anti-aircraft defense in the Pacific. Ensign George Gay, flying in the trailing position, can see the Japanese carriers ahead, 4 of them. And above those carriers, climbing down from altitude like wolves sensing prey, he counts what he later estimates as more than 40 Zero fighters. The math is simple and brutal. 15 slow torpedo bombers against 40 fighters. Gay knows how this ends. Every man in the squadron knows. They attack anyway. The TBD Devastator was obsolete before the war started. This isn't historical hindsight. American naval aviators knew it in 1941. The aircraft had entered service in 1937, and by the standards of that era, it was adequate. But aviation technology was advancing rapidly. By mid-1942, the Devastator was comprehensively outclassed. Its maximum speed was 206 miles per hour. The Zero fighter's maximum speed was 331 miles per hour. You cannot run from something that's 60% faster than you are. The Devastator's defensive armament was a single 30 caliber machine gun in the rear cockpit. The Zero had 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns. The firepower disparity wasn't marginal, it was categorical. And most damningly, the torpedo the Devastator carried, the Mark 13, had to be dropped at low speed and low altitude, which meant the attacking aircraft had to fly straight and level, directly into defensive fire for the final approach. It was a flying coffin. What makes this even worse is that the replacement aircraft existed. The TBF Avenger had been designed specifically to address the Devastator's shortcomings. It was faster, better armored, more heavily armed. Production had begun, but manufacturing capacity and logistics meant that only 6 Avengers were available at Midway in early June. 6 aircraft. The rest of the torpedo squadrons, 41 aircraft total across Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were flying Devastators. This wasn't a tactical choice. It was an economic and industrial reality. The better aircraft hadn't reached the fleet yet, so the men flew what they had, and what they had was inadequate. Waldron's approach is direct, no fancy tactics, no attempt at deception, just a straight run at the nearest carrier, which appears to be Kaga. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol sees them coming from miles away. The Zeros dive to intercept. What happens next is documented in Gay's water level account, written 4 days after the battle while recovering on Midway. His handwriting is shaky. Some words are smudged, possibly by water damage from his ordeal floating in the ocean. He writes, "I counted 15 zeros on Lieutenant Evans' plane. It looked like someone poured gasoline on it and threw a match." Evans' aircraft doesn't explode immediately. It burns as it flies, shedding pieces, and then cartwheels into the ocean. Gay watches this happen in the space of perhaps 10 seconds. Then the Zeros shift attention to the next aircraft in line. The attack lasts 11 minutes from first contact to the last aircraft going down. 11 minutes. In that time, 15 Devastators are destroyed. 0 hits on the target. Not because the pilots failed to press the attack. They pressed it. Several aircraft got close enough to drop torpedoes. But the Mark 13 torpedo had a defect rate of approximately 20%. 1 in 5 would fail to run correctly, even if dropped perfectly. And dropping perfectly required flying straight at low altitude through intense anti-aircraft fire. Some torpedoes ran too deep. Some failed to arm. Some simply malfunctioned. Of the torpedoes that did run correctly, the slow speed, 33 knots, made them relatively easy for alerted ships to evade by turning. The combination of obsolete aircraft, defective torpedoes, and overwhelming defensive fire meant that Torpedo Squadron 8 achieved nothing tactically, except to die. Gay survives because his aircraft is shot down close enough to the Japanese fleet that he can watch the battle from the water. He floats for hours, hiding under a seat cushion when Japanese ships pass close by, watching American dive bombers arrive, and watching Japanese carriers burn. His survival is pure chance. He happens to end up in water rather than dying in the initial crash, happens to stay afloat long enough to be rescued the next day, happens not to be strafed by patrolling Japanese fighters. His account is the only first-person record we have of the torpedo attacks from someone who was there for the entire sequence. And what emerges from his testimony is a picture not of tactical error, but of systematic material failure. These men were sent to attack with tools that were insufficient for the job. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacks next. They've approached from a different vector, haven't coordinated with Waldron's squadron. There was no time and no ability to communicate across the different carrier air groups once they'd launched. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay leads 14 Devastators in. The same scenario repeats. 0 combat air patrol intercepts. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers and cruisers. Lindsay's aircraft is hit almost immediately. He continues the attack. His plane is burning as he closes to drop range. He releases his torpedo. The aircraft crashes seconds later. Lindsay is killed. Of the 14 aircraft, 10 are shot down. 4 return to Enterprise. None of the torpedoes hit. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown arrives approximately 20 minutes later. They have fighter escort, 6 Wildcats. The fighters engage the 0 cap and are quickly overwhelmed. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey leads 12 Devastators into the attack. The pattern is grimly familiar now. Zeros diving from altitude. Aircraft burning and falling into the sea. Torpedoes dropped from planes that are already doomed. Massey's aircraft is hit. He circles, trying to lead his squadron in despite the damage, and then crashes into the ocean. 10 of the 12 Devastators are destroyed. 2 return. No hits achieved. The mathematics of this are almost incomprehensible. 41 torpedo bombers launched from 3 carriers. 35 shot down. 6 return. 0 hits on target. The casualty rate is over 85%. In any reasonable tactical framework, this would be catastrophic failure. And yet there's a persistent narrative in American histories of Midway that these attacks were necessary, that they drew down the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, that they created the conditions for the dive bombers to succeed. I struggle with this interpretation. The evidence suggests it's more complicated. Japanese Combat Air Patrol logs, reconstructed from survivor accounts and radio logs, indicate that the 0 fighters engaged the torpedo squadrons at low altitude for approximately 8 to 11 minutes per attack. They then returned to their patrol stations at altitude. By the time the American dive bombers arrived at roughly 10:22 hours, most of the Zeros had climbed back up. They weren't caught low. They weren't exhausted or out of ammunition. They were simply looking in the wrong direction, down at the water where they'd just destroyed the torpedo squadrons, rather than up at the altitude where the dive bombers were beginning their attack runs. Did the torpedo attacks contribute to this? Marginally, perhaps. But to claim they were decisive feels like a post hoc rationalization of a disaster. What I find more persuasive is that the torpedo attacks represented a doctrinal commitment to combined arms strikes that simply didn't materialize as planned. The American plan was for fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers to arrive simultaneously and attack from different vectors and altitudes. This would overwhelm the defenses. Fighters would have to choose between engaging high-altitude dive bombers or low-altitude torpedo planes. Couldn't effectively do both. But the coordination fell apart during the transit from the carriers. Different squadrons got separated. Some found the Japanese fleet early, some arrived late. Instead of a coordinated, overwhelming strike, it became a piecemeal series of attacks that the Japanese could defeat in detail. The torpedo squadrons went in first, alone, because they arrived first, and they were slaughtered because they arrived alone. The human cost is easier to quantify than the tactical effect. Torpedo Squadron 8, 15 men launched, 1 survived. Torpedo Squadron 6, 14 launched, 4 returned but several of those were wounded. Torpedo Squadron 3, 12 launched, 2 returned. These weren't anonymous statistics. These were trained naval aviators, men who'd spent years learning their trade. Lieutenant Commander Waldron was 41 years old, an experienced pilot who'd been in naval aviation since the early 1920s. Lieutenant Commander Lindsay was a 38-year-old academy graduate, a professional officer with nearly 2 decades of service. These weren't expendable resources. They were irreplaceable expertise, and they were expended in attacks that accomplished nothing measurable except to demonstrate that courage is not a substitute for adequate equipment. I keep returning to the question of whether this was necessary. Could these squadrons have been held back, not launched at all? Their pilots preserved for future battles where they might have had better tools? The answer is no, operationally. Once the decision was made to strike the Japanese carriers, every available aircraft had to be committed. Holding back torpedo squadrons while sending only dive bombers would have reduced striking power. The doctrine called for coordinated attacks. The attacks just didn't stay coordinated. But there's a deeper question about whether the TBD Devastator should have still been in frontline service at all. The aircraft was obsolete. The Navy knew it. The replacement existed. But industrial capacity and logistics meant the obsolete aircraft were still flying combat missions 6 months into the war. This is what happens when war starts before you're fully prepared. Men die using tools that were known to be inadequate because better tools haven't reached them yet. Gay's account ends with him floating in the water, watching the Japanese carriers burn in the afternoon sun. He writes, "I was close enough to see men on the deck of one carrier trying to fight the fires. Then there was an explosion, and they disappeared." He's describing Kaga, or Akagi, burning from the dive bomber hits that came after his squadron was destroyed. His written account doesn't express bitterness or regret. It's factual, observational, but the subtext is clear. He watched his entire squadron die in an attack that achieved nothing. Then, hours later, he watched different American aircraft succeed where his squadron had failed. The difference wasn't courage. Both groups had that in abundance. The difference was that the dive bombers attacked from altitude, with better aircraft, at a moment when the Japanese were distracted. The torpedo squadrons attacked low, with obsolete aircraft, and were destroyed piecemeal. Courage alone cannot overcome systemic material disadvantage. Chapter 9. 5 Minutes That Changed the World. The Dive Bomber Attack. The 4th of June, 1942, 10:22 hours. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's SBD Dauntless is running low on fuel. He's been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 90 minutes, flying an expanding square search pattern southwest of where intelligence said the enemy should be. His fuel gauge shows maybe 40 minutes of flying time remaining. After that, he'll have to ditch in the ocean and hope for rescue. His wingmen are in the same situation. 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, burning fuel, finding nothing but empty water. McCluskey faces the decision that will define his life. Turn back now and save his pilots, or continue searching and risk losing the entire formation to fuel exhaustion. He chooses to continue. 5 minutes later, he spots a single Japanese destroyer racing northeast, throwing a prominent wake. The destroyer is the Arashi. She's been delayed attacking an American submarine and is now rushing to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey makes a bet. Follow the destroyer. She's going somewhere. That somewhere is probably where the carriers are. The SBD Dauntless was not a revolutionary aircraft. It was a competent, well-designed dive bomber that did its job effectively within its design parameters. Maximum speed, 255 miles per hour. Bomb load, 1,000 pounds carried externally. Range, approximately 1,100 miles with maximum fuel. What made the Dauntless effective wasn't superior performance, but reliability and the tactics built around it. The aircraft was stable in a dive. The perforated dive brakes allowed steep attack angles, 60 to 70 degrees, without the aircraft accelerating beyond controllable speed. The bomb sight was simple but adequate, and critically, the doctrine for dive bombing emphasized individual pilot skill rather than formation rigidity. Each pilot aimed his own aircraft, chose his own release point, bore personal responsibility for hitting the target. This created a kind of distributed lethality. You couldn't disrupt a dive bomber attack the way you could disrupt a formation attack. Each aircraft was operating semi-independently. At 10:05 hours, McCluskey's formation spots the Japanese carriers, 4 of them in a loose box formation with numerous screening ships. The carriers are in the process of recovering aircraft from the first Midway strike and preparing for a second strike on the American task force. Flight decks are busy. Aircraft are spotted both on the decks and in the hangar bays below. Fuel lines are running. Ordnance is being moved. It's the worst possible moment to be attacked, and the Japanese don't know the attack is coming because they're looking down at the water, where they've just massacred the American torpedo squadrons. McCluskey assigns targets. His squadrons will attack the 2 nearest carriers, Akagi and Kaga. He begins his run. There's a source conflict here about precise timing that matters, because it speaks to whether this was coordinated or coincidental. McCluskey's after-action report states he began his attack run at 10:05 hours. Japanese records from Akagi indicate the first bomb struck at 10:22 hours. That's a 17-minute discrepancy. Part of this might be clock synchronization, different ships and aircraft using slightly different time references. Part might be memory compression, McCluskey writing his report days later, relying on memory for specific times. What we know with certainty is that between spotting the carriers and the first bombs hitting, some number of minutes elapsed while the dive bombers climbed to attack altitude and positioned themselves. Those minutes are historically significant because of what else was happening. At approximately 10:18 hours, within minutes of McCluskey's attack, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bomber squadron from Yorktown arrives over the Japanese fleet from a completely different vector. Leslie has 17 SBDs. He's been searching independently, hasn't coordinated with McCluskey, doesn't know Enterprise's aircraft are in the area. He assigns his squadron to attack Soryu, the 3rd Japanese carrier. So now we have 50 dive bombers, 33 from Enterprise, 17 from Yorktown, arriving within approximately 4 to 6 minutes of each other, attacking from different directions, hitting 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers simultaneously. This convergence is either extraordinary coordination or extraordinary coincidence. The historical consensus is coincidence, but I find myself bothered by how probability-defying it seems. The dive bomber attack itself is swift and devastating. McCluskey's aircraft push over into 70-degree dives from approximately 14,000 feet. Terminal velocity for a 1,000-pound bomb dropped from that altitude at that angle is approximately 560 miles per hour. The bomb is in flight for roughly 30 seconds from release to impact. The physics are straightforward. Gravity accelerates the bomb. The aircraft's forward motion adds horizontal velocity. The combination creates a ballistic trajectory that, if the pilot has judged altitude, airspeed, and angle correctly, intersects with the target. The bomb sight helps, but ultimately, it's pilot skill and judgment that determines accuracy. And on this day, the pilots are accurate. Akagi is hit by 3 bombs in rapid succession. The first penetrates the midship elevator and detonates in the upper hangar. Aircraft are parked there, some armed with torpedoes, some being rearmed with bombs. Aviation fuel is flowing through hoses as the rearming operation continues. The bomb's detonation ignites the fuel. Secondary explosions follow as torpedo warheads cook off. The second bomb hits aft, near the steering gear, jamming the rudder. The third hits forward, starting fires that spread to the flight deck. Within 5 minutes of the first hit, Akagi is catastrophically damaged. Her flight deck is unusable. Fires are spreading through the hangar decks. Damage control parties are overwhelmed. She's still afloat, still has power, but as a functional warship, she's finished. Kaga takes 4 bomb hits. The first strikes the flight deck near the forward elevator, penetrating through to the hangar deck where it detonates among parked aircraft. Like Akagi, Kaga has aircraft being rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes are out of their magazines, sitting on carts or already mounted to aircraft, waiting for the order to launch. The explosion creates a chain reaction. Fuel ignites, ordnance detonates. A massive fire erupts that quickly becomes uncontrollable. The second and third bombs hit amidships, compounding the damage. The fourth hits aft. Kaga's captain orders damage control, but the fires have already spread beyond the capacity of his crews to contain. The ship is doomed within minutes of being hit. Soryu, attacked by Leslie's Yorktown squadron, takes 3 direct hits. The first bomb penetrates the flight deck and detonates in the hangar among rearming aircraft. The explosion is catastrophic. The entire hangar deck becomes an inferno within seconds. The second and third bombs hit almost simultaneously, one forward and one amidships, spreading the fires. Soryu's damage control is somewhat better than Akagi's or Kaga's. She has more functional foam generators, better trained parties, but it doesn't matter. The scale of the fires exceeds any ship's capacity to fight them when the hangar deck is full of fuel and ordnance. Within 10 minutes, Soryu is a burning wreck. The technical detail that makes this devastation possible is not the bombs themselves, but where the bombs hit and what they hit. A 1,000-pound bomb is certainly destructive, but it's not necessarily ship-killing. Naval vessels are designed to absorb significant damage. Battleships routinely took multiple bomb and torpedo hits and remained operational. But carriers are uniquely vulnerable. Their operational design requires large, open hangar spaces full of highly flammable and explosive materials. Aviation fuel has a flash point far lower than bunker oil. Torpedoes and bombs are designed to explode. When you pack these materials into a confined steel box and then detonate a bomb in that space, the results are predictably catastrophic. The Japanese carriers were killed not by the bombs directly, but by their own ordnance and fuel detonating in sympathetic explosions. There's a critical detail here that explains why this was so much worse than it might have been. Japanese doctrine called for storing bombs and torpedoes on the hangar deck during rearming operations, rather than bringing them up individually from magazines as needed. The reason was operational efficiency. Rearming could proceed faster if the ordnance was immediately available, rather than having to send for each weapon individually. This saved perhaps 15 to 20 minutes during a rearmament cycle. But it meant that when the bombs hit, there were dozens of armed torpedoes and hundreds of bombs sitting exposed on the hangar deck. American carriers used a different procedure. Ordnance stayed in magazines until immediately before being mounted to aircraft. This was slower. It reduced efficiency, but it also meant that a hit on the hangar deck was less likely to trigger massive secondary explosions. McCluskey's navigation decision, to follow the destroyer Arashi's wake rather than turning back, is often called miraculous or fortunate. I find myself skeptical of that framing. It was a calculated risk based on operational logic. A destroyer racing northeast is probably returning to the fleet. Following her is probably the fastest way to find the carriers. The decision wasn't intuitive brilliance. It was professional judgment applied under pressure. Where the luck enters is in timing. If McCluskey had found the Japanese fleet 10 minutes earlier, the carriers might have had aircraft already launched. Flight decks empty, ordnance secured. 10 minutes later, and the Japanese might have launched a strike toward the American carriers first, making the attack run far more dangerous. The convergence of multiple factors, McCluskey's navigation, Leslie's simultaneous arrival, the Japanese carriers caught with full decks, creates a phase transition where the battle's outcome shifts dramatically within a 5-minute window. To me, the most striking aspect of this attack is not the drama, but the efficiency. 50 aircraft attack 3 carriers. 10 bombs hit. 3 carriers are functionally destroyed within 10 minutes. The hit rate is 20%. 1 in 5 bombs finds the target. This is actually quite good for dive bombing, where 30% was considered excellent and 10 to 15% was more typical. The pilots are skilled, the aircraft are adequate, the tactics work, and most importantly, the Japanese are caught in precisely the vulnerable position that intelligence and timing have created. They're recovering aircraft, they're rearming. Their combat air patrol is at the wrong altitude, looking in the wrong direction. Their radar, which doesn't exist, can't warn them. And the attack comes from two directions simultaneously, overwhelming any chance of coordinated defense. By 10:30 hours, 8 minutes after the first bomb hits, 3 Japanese carriers are burning. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, is undamaged and will launch a counterstrike within the hour. But the strategic equation has already shifted. Japan came to Midway with 4 carriers. They now have 1. The Americans came with 3 carriers. They still have 3, though Yorktown will be hit later in the day. The margin has reversed, and it reversed not through attrition or prolonged combat, but through 5 minutes of concentrated violence, delivered at the precise moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability. Wars don't always turn on dramatic speeches or grand strategy. Sometimes they turn on a pilot's decision to follow a destroyer's wake when fuel is running low and the target is nowhere to be found. Chapter 10. The Fires Below. Damage Control as Cultural Failure. The 4th of June, 1942, 10:30 hours. Below decks on the carrier Kaga, Lieutenant Kunio Saito is trying to fight a fire with equipment that doesn't work. He's the ship's damage control officer. His job, in theory, is to contain and extinguish fires, to patch holes, to keep the ship operational despite damage. In practice, he's discovering that the foam generators he's relying on were never refilled after the previous day's drill. He has seawater pumps. He has bucket chains of sailors passing water from portable pumps. But he doesn't have the foam concentrate that's designed to suppress aviation fuel fires. The hangar deck is burning. The temperature is rising so fast that paint on the bulkheads is beginning to blister. And his primary firefighting tool doesn't work because nobody remembered to refill the tanks. A partial fragment of his damage control report survived the sinking and was recovered in 1999. Fire in Hangar Bay 2, 10:30 hours. Foam supply exhausted by 10:55. Crew attempting bucket chain from sea. The last sentence is unfinished. Perhaps he never finished writing it. Perhaps the paper was lost. Either way, the message is clear. They're losing. Damage control is the unglamorous foundation of naval survivability. It's not about heroic charges or brilliant tactics. It's about training sailors to fight fires, to patch holes, to maintain stability when the ship is flooding, to restore power when generators fail. It's technical work, requiring specialized knowledge and constant practice. American and British navies had learned hard lessons about damage control during World War I and the interwar period. They developed comprehensive training programs, specialized equipment, detailed damage control manuals. They treated it as a professional discipline, as important as gunnery or navigation. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, treated damage control as a secondary concern. It wasn't that they had no damage control procedures. They did. But those procedures were under-resourced, under-trained, and under-prioritized compared to offensive capabilities. Let me give you specific numbers, because they illustrate the cultural difference. USS Yorktown's damage control complement was approximately 200 men. These were sailors whose primary job was damage control. They trained constantly in firefighting, shoring, pump operation, and emergency repairs. They had dedicated equipment, portable pumps, foam generators, shoring timbers, welding equipment, emergency lighting. Akagi's damage control complement was 45 men. That's less than 1/4 the size of Yorktown's team. And these weren't full-time damage control specialists. They were sailors who had damage control as a secondary duty. Their primary jobs were in engineering or deck divisions. They received basic training, but not the intensive, repetitive drilling that creates genuine expertise. When crisis came, they were expected to perform specialized technical tasks they'd only practiced occasionally. The equipment disparity was equally stark. Akagi's foam concentrate supply was specified at 12,000 gallons in the design documents. Actual inventory on June 4th, 4,200 gallons. That's a 65% shortfall. Why? Because foam concentrate was expensive, had to be imported. And the peacetime budgets that governed supply purchasing prioritized visible offensive capabilities, aircraft, torpedoes, ammunition, over invisible defensive capabilities like firefighting supplies. Nobody gets promoted for having well-stocked foam magazines. You get promoted for leading successful strikes. So when resources were scarce and choices had to be made, the choices consistently favored offense over resilience. The chemistry of the foam itself matters here. 1942-era firefighting foam came in two main types: protein-based foam and chemical foam. Japanese ships used protein foam, which was derived from animal proteins, and created a blanket over burning fuel to suppress vapor release. American ships had begun transitioning to improved chemical foams that were more effective against petroleum fires. The American foam was approximately 40% more effective at suppressing aviation fuel fires, specifically. This wasn't a huge difference, but in a marginal situation where every percentage point of effectiveness matters, 40% can be the difference between controlling a fire and losing the ship. At 10:40 hours, approximately 10 minutes after the first bomb hit Akagi, secondary explosions begin as the fire reaches torpedo warheads in the hangar. A Type 91 aerial torpedo carried a 450-pound warhead. When that warhead detonates, it's not designed to breach a ship's hull from inside. It's designed to explode underwater against external armor. But the blast effect in the confined space of a hangar deck is devastating. Bulkheads buckle, deck plating deforms. The fire that was previously contained to one section of the hangar now spreads throughout the ship. Saito's damage control parties are forced back by the heat and blast. They're trying, they're courageous, but they're losing ground because they don't have the equipment, the training, or the doctrine to handle this scale of fire. There's a remarkable contrast available in the historical record. USS Yorktown was hit by 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes over the course of several hours on June 4th. Her damage control teams fought fires, contained flooding, restored power, and kept the ship operational for 2 additional days before a Japanese submarine finally finished her off. The initial bomb hits caused fires in the hangar deck, similar to what happened on Akagi. Yorktown's damage control teams used foam to suppress the fires, established boundaries to contain the damage, maintained power to critical systems, and had the carrier ready to receive aircraft again within 90 minutes. Then she was hit by 2 torpedoes that flooded multiple compartments and knocked out power. The damage control teams shifted focus to counterflooding to correct the list, to establishing emergency power, to keeping the ship afloat. They succeeded. Yorktown didn't sink from battle damage. She sank 2 days later from a submarine attack when her escorts had left to refuel. The difference between Yorktown's survival for days and Akagi's functional death within an hour isn't that American bombs were weaker or that Japanese damage was worse. It's that Yorktown had damage control capability that Akagi lacked. When I read Saito's testimony, he survived and was interviewed after the war. What strikes me is how often he uses variations of the phrase, "We were not trained for this." Not, "We tried and failed," or "The damage was too severe," but "We were not trained." He describes arriving at a fire scene and discovering his crews didn't know how to operate the foam generators under combat conditions. They drilled with them, but drilling in calm conditions with unlimited time is different from operating complex equipment in darkness, heat, smoke, and panic. He describes finding that emergency lighting had never been properly installed in some compartments, so his crews were fighting fires in darkness. He describes attempting to counterflood to correct a developing list, only to discover that the counterflooding procedures were in a manual that nobody could find in the chaos. The cultural issue runs deeper than just training hours or equipment stockpiles. The Japanese Navy conceptualized damage control as what you do after you've lost. The real goal was to hit the enemy so hard and so fast that they never got a chance to hit you back. This was Genda's first strike doctrine, applied institutionally. If you're planning to always strike first, always hit harder, always maintain initiative, then damage control becomes theoretically unnecessary. You won't take damage because you'll destroy the enemy before they can attack you effectively. This worked for 14 months. Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon. The Kido Butai struck first and overwhelmed the enemy before taking serious damage. But when the doctrine finally failed, when they were the ones being hit first, the institutional muscle memory for defensive operations simply didn't exist. By 1200 hours, less than 90 minutes after being hit, Akagi's captain orders abandon efforts to save the ship. The fires are uncontrollable. Secondary explosions are continuing. The ship is still afloat, still has some power, but as a fighting unit, she's finished. Compare this to USS Franklin, a different American carrier hit later in the war by a devastating Japanese air attack that killed over 800 crew. Franklin's damage control teams fought fires for hours, eventually bringing them under control. The ship was able to steam under her own power back to Pearl Harbor, then eventually to New York for repairs. She was more heavily damaged than Akagi. More fires, more casualties, more structural damage. But she survived because her damage control doctrine prioritized survivability, and her crews were trained to implement that doctrine under the worst possible conditions. The final detail that crystallizes this for me: American carriers had approximately 200 damage control personnel. Japanese carriers had 45. But Japanese carriers also had larger aircrew complements, more pilots, more mechanics, more ordnance handlers. The design philosophy was clear: maximize offensive striking power, accept reduced resilience. This is a coherent strategy if you're confident you'll always strike first. But confidence isn't reality, and when reality doesn't match doctrine, men die in fires they were never trained to fight, using equipment that was never adequately supplied, following procedures that were never properly developed. Kaga and Akagi didn't sink immediately. They burned for hours before finally going under. The men aboard those ships fought bravely to save them. But bravery alone cannot compensate for systemic underinvestment in unglamorous capabilities like damage control. Chapter 11. Hiryu's Revenge, the counterstrike that almost worked. The 4th of June, 1942, 10:58 hours. Aboard the carrier Hiryu, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi receives confirmation that 3 of his 4 carriers are burning. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, all hit, all effectively out of action. Only Hiryu remains operational. Yamaguchi faces a choice. He can withdraw, preserve his 1 remaining carrier, and live to fight another day. Or he can attack immediately with whatever aircraft are available, accepting that he's operating at a massive numerical disadvantage. Yamaguchi chooses attack. He orders every available aircraft armed and launched immediately. No time for coordination with Yamamoto's surface fleet. No time for reconnaissance to confirm the American carrier's exact position. Just launch everything and strike as hard as possible before the Americans can hit him. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, leading the dive bomber squadron, receives his mission briefing on a waterlogged notepad that survives in the archives. 18 dive bombers, 40% fuel, 1 target, no second chances. Below the text, someone has drawn a small cross. Prayer or premonition, it's impossible to say. Hiryu has 27 aircraft immediately available, 18 D-3A Val dive bombers, and 9 A-6M0 fighters as escort. It's a fraction of what a full carrier air group should be able to launch, but it's what Yamaguchi has. The rest of Hiryu's aircraft are either still returning from the Midway strike or are being serviced and won't be ready for hours. So, 18 dive bombers will have to be enough. Kobayashi knows the odds. He's attacking 3 American carriers. Intelligence suggests Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown are all operational, with less than 2 full squadrons. But he also knows that doing nothing guarantees defeat. At least this way there's a chance. The launch begins at 1100 hours. The aircraft form up and head southeast, based on the last known position of American ships. There's no reconnaissance aircraft ahead to scout the route. There's no updated intelligence. Kobayashi is navigating by dead reckoning and educated guesswork. The Americans have radar. The Americans have better intelligence. The Americans have numerical superiority. But Kobayashi has one advantage. He's attacking first from Hiryu, while the Americans are still recovering aircraft from their strike on the other 3 Japanese carriers. If he can hit them while their decks are full, while they're vulnerable, he might achieve something. At approximately 1200 hours, Kobayashi's formation finds the American task force. More precisely, they find Yorktown. She's been operating independently from Enterprise and Hornet, and she happens to be the first carrier Kobayashi's formation encounters. Pure chance. If the navigation had been slightly different, they might have found Enterprise or Hornet first. But they find Yorktown, and Yorktown becomes the target. Radar picks up the incoming Japanese formation at roughly 60 miles. Combat Air Patrol is vectored to intercept. This is where the technology gap that I discussed in Chapter 6 becomes operationally decisive. The Americans know the attack is coming. They have time, not a lot of time, but some, to prepare. Here's where the source conflict becomes important. American after-action reports credit radar-directed fighter interception with shooting down 10 of the 18 attacking dive bombers before they reached Yorktown. Japanese records suggest 13 aircraft were lost to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. That's a 3-aircraft discrepancy, which might seem minor, but represents nearly 20% of the attacking force. Did the Americans overclaim kills in the confusion of combat? Did the Japanese undercount losses for face-saving reasons? Probably some of both. What we know with certainty is that Kobayashi's formation was significantly depleted before reaching bombing position, but not completely stopped. At 12:10 hours, the remaining Japanese dive bombers push into their attack runs. Yorktown's anti-aircraft defenses open fire. The 5-inch guns engage at long range. The 40mm and 20mm guns engage as the aircraft close. The sky fills with tracer fire and explosive shells. It's not enough. 3 bombs hit Yorktown in rapid succession. The first bomb penetrates the flight deck near the midship elevator and detonates in the uptakes, the ducts that carry smoke from the boilers to the funnel. The explosion ruptures these ducts, filling the engineering spaces below with smoke and toxic gases. Boiler fires have to be extinguished to prevent asphyxiating the engineering crews. Yorktown slows to a crawl, then stops completely. No power, no way to make steam, no propulsion. The second bomb hits the flight deck slightly forward of the first, starting fires. The third bomb hits aft, compounding the damage. Within 10 minutes of the attack, Yorktown is dead in the water. But, and this is critical, she's not sinking. Her damage control teams are already fighting the fires. The bomb damage, while severe, hasn't breached the hull below the waterline. She's not flooding. She's vulnerable, but she's still afloat, and her crews are working to restore function. This is the difference that proper damage control doctrine creates. Yorktown has been hit as hard as Akagi was, but Yorktown's damage control teams know what to do. They have the equipment. They have the training. They start working the problem. By 1300 hours, 90 minutes after being hit, Yorktown has fires under control. Her engineering crews have restored power to 3 of her boilers. She's making headway again, not full speed, but enough to maneuver and potentially operate aircraft. This is an extraordinary feat of damage control. The ship took 3 bomb hits that would have functionally killed a Japanese carrier. Her crews absorbed the damage, contained it, and restored basic functionality in 90 minutes. Kobayashi's attack was successful in hitting the target, but it wasn't successful in achieving the same kind of catastrophic destruction that American bombs achieved on the Japanese carriers. The difference isn't the bombs. The difference is what happens after the bombs hit. At 14:30 hours, Hiryu launches a second strike. 10B, 5N, Kate torpedo bombers with 6-0 escorts. This is everything Yamaguchi has left that's operational. He's throwing everything at the Americans in hopes of sinking at least one carrier before Hiryu herself is inevitably attacked. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga leads this strike. His aircraft was damaged during the morning Midway attack. The fuel tank has a puncture and is leaking. He knows he doesn't have enough fuel to return to Hiryu. He leads the attack anyway. This isn't fanatical devotion to death. This is professional calculation. The mission needs a leader. He's the most experienced available. His personal survival is less important than giving the strike its best chance of success. He goes. The torpedo attack finds Yorktown again. She's still recovering from the dive bomber attack, still not at full capability. The torpedo bombers come in low, right at wave-top height, from multiple directions. Yorktown's combat air patrol engages them. Anti-aircraft fire is intense. But the Japanese pilots are skilled. They've trained for this. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown on her port side, almost simultaneously. The explosions breach the hull. Seawater floods into multiple compartments. The ship develops a severe list to port. Estimates range from 17 to 23 degrees. Damage control teams attempt counterflooding to correct the list, but the damage is too extensive. Electrical power fails throughout most of the ship. By 1500 hours, Yorktown's captain orders, "Prepare to abandon ship." The crew doesn't actually abandon yet. They continue trying to save her, but it's clear that Yorktown has taken fatal damage. Except, she hasn't. Not quite. Yorktown stays afloat. Damage control teams continue working. The list is stabilized through counter-flooding. The immediate flooding is controlled. Pumps are brought online to remove water from flooded compartments. By evening, a salvage crew is back aboard trying to save the ship. She remains afloat for 2 more days before the Japanese submarine I-168 finally puts torpedoes into her, and she sinks. This is resilience. This is what proper damage control doctrine looks like. Yorktown absorbed 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes over 3 hours. She was functionally killed twice, and each time, damage control brought her back to some level of operation. She ultimately sank, but not from battle damage alone. She sank because a submarine found her while she was crippled and vulnerable, and finished the job. What haunts me about Hiryu's attacks is how close they came to changing the battle's outcome. If Kobayashi had found Enterprise or Hornet instead of Yorktown, he might have hit a carrier that wasn't already damaged. If Tomonaga's torpedo attack had coordinated with the dive bomber attack, instead of arriving 2 hours later, the combined strike might have overwhelmed Yorktown's defenses completely. If Yamaguchi had all 4 carriers available instead of 1, he could have launched a strike of 100 aircraft instead of 28, and that mass might have sunk 2 or 3 American carriers instead of crippling 1. The tactical execution was excellent. Kobayashi's navigation without reconnaissance support was impressive. Tomonaga's leadership was exemplary. The pilots were skilled and brave. But 1 carrier versus 3 isn't sustainable mathematics, no matter how well you execute. By 1600 hours, American dive bombers from Enterprise have located Hiryu and attacked her. 4 bombs hit. Hiryu's hangar deck becomes an inferno, just like Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu before her. Her damage control teams fight the fires, but they're overwhelmed for the same reasons the other carriers were. Insufficient training, inadequate equipment, ordnance detonating in secondary explosions. By evening, Hiryu is abandoned and sinking. Yamaguchi chooses to go down with his ship. He's the senior admiral present. He commanded the counterstrike that almost worked, and when it fails, he accepts responsibility in the most final way possible. His body was never recovered. The tactical lesson of Hiryu's strikes is that skill and determination alone cannot overcome numerical insufficiency. Yamaguchi's aggressive decision to attack immediately was correct within his constraints. Waiting would only have allowed the Americans to consolidate their advantage. But attacking with 1 carrier's worth of aircraft against 3 carriers, plus their combined combat air patrol and anti-aircraft defenses, was never going to achieve decisive results. The best he could hope for was to damage the American force enough to buy time, to create some operational breathing room. He damaged Yorktown severely, but Enterprise and Hornet remained untouched, and they still had aircraft to strike back. The arithmetic wasn't forgiving. It never is. Chapter 12, The Night That Wasn't, Yamamoto's Failure to Close. The 4th of June, 1942, 1800 hours. Aboard the battleship Yamato, flagship of the combined fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sits in his cabin reviewing damage reports. 4 carriers lost. Hiryu still fighting, but clearly doomed. The Kido Butai, the striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, has effectively ceased to exist. Yamamoto's personal log entry for 1800 hours reads, 4 carriers lost, surface fleet intact, range to enemy 350 miles. The next entry is blank until 0600 hours the following morning. 10 hours of silence in a log that normally contains multiple entries per hour. What happened during those 10 hours? What was Yamamoto thinking? We don't know. The historical record shows us only the decision he made, to withdraw, to turn the fleet west and abandon the battle. But the fleet he commanded included 11 battleships and 16 cruisers. The Americans had 3 carriers and 8 cruisers. Yamamoto's surface fleet outgunned Spruance's task force by a devastating margin. So why didn't he use it? Yamamoto's strategic situation at 1800 hours was poor, but not hopeless. He'd lost his carriers, yes, but the carrier age, while dawning, hadn't completely replaced the battleship age. Battleships still had a role. They could fight at night when carrier aircraft couldn't operate. They could engage surface forces with gunfire at ranges carrier aircraft might not be able to reach. Yamamoto had built his entire carrier force around the concept of the decisive battle. Well, the carriers had failed to achieve that, but the decisive battle could still happen. It would just happen with different weapons, at night, within gun range. The staff debate in Yamato's operations room apparently centered on exactly this question: close for night action or withdraw? The mathematics favored closing. Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons and carried 9 18.1-inch guns that could fire 3,200-pound shells to 45,000 yards. The American carrier's longest-range weapon was the 5-inch anti-aircraft gun at 18,000 yards. That's a 2.5 to 1 range advantage. Yamamoto also had 10 additional battleships, each with gun ranges exceeding anything the Americans could bring to bear at night. And critically, the Japanese Navy had superior night fighting doctrine. They'd trained extensively for night surface combat. Their optical equipment, rangefinders, binoculars, night vision glasses, was better than American equivalents. They had better torpedoes that worked reliably. They had doctrine and training for fighting in darkness. The Americans, by contrast, dreaded night surface combat. They'd had bad experiences early in the war. Repeated defeats in night battles around Guadalcanal would prove this within months. So, Yamamoto had advantages: material advantages, tactical advantages, training advantages, and he chose not to use them. At 1900 hours, he orders the fleet to advance cautiously toward the enemy. This is hedging language. It's not a commitment to night action. It's not a withdrawal. It's a middle option that does neither thing decisively. The fleet advances, slowly, while Yamamoto waits for more information. What information? Intelligence on American carrier positions? Confirmation of how many carriers remain operational? Clarification of whether American submarines are positioned for night ambush? The operational record doesn't specify what Yamamoto was waiting for. It only shows that he waited. There's a source conflict here that goes to Yamamoto's state of mind. His chief of staff, in post-war testimony, claimed Yamamoto feared submarine ambush. He argued that the admiral believed American submarines were positioned along likely approach routes and would devastate the surface fleet before it could close to gun range. This is plausible. Submarines were certainly a threat, but American submarine logs show no submarines were positioned for night fleet action in the area Yamamoto would have transited. Either Yamamoto overestimated the submarine threat based on poor intelligence, or the chief of staff invented this justification after the fact to explain an inexplicable decision. I lean toward the latter interpretation, because submarine threat alone doesn't explain the degree of caution. Yamamoto had destroyer screens, had anti-submarine doctrine, had the capability to minimize submarine risk through aggressive maneuvering. He chose not to. At 2200 hours, 4 hours after his initial advance cautiously order, Yamamoto orders general withdrawal. The entire surface fleet turns west and begins retiring toward Japan. The battle is over. Not because the Japanese fleet was destroyed. It wasn't. Not because they'd run out of options. They hadn't. But because Yamamoto chose to disengage rather than risk his battleships in a night action against carriers that were, at night, essentially defenseless. This decision is one of the great might-have-beens of the Pacific War. If Yamamoto had closed to gun range, if his battleships had engaged the American carriers at night, what would have happened? We can't know with certainty, but we can make educated assessments based on capabilities and doctrine. The Americans, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, were also considering night action. Spruance's decision calculus was different from Yamamoto's. He had carriers. They'd been successful during the day, but at night, they were vulnerable. Carrier aircraft don't operate effectively in darkness, not in 1942, without modern night fighting equipment. If Japanese surface forces closed to gun range, Spruance's carriers became targets, not weapons platforms. His surface escorts, cruisers and destroyers, were outgunned by Yamamoto's battleships. The intelligent move was to withdraw east, maintain distance, and resume air operations at dawn, which is exactly what Spruance did. He withdrew. Both admirals withdrew, maintaining a separation of roughly 300 miles overnight. But here's the critical difference. Spruance was withdrawing from a position of success. He'd sunk 4 Japanese carriers. His mission, defend Midway, attrite the Japanese fleet, was accomplished. Further risk wasn't necessary. Yamamoto was withdrawing from a position of failure. His carriers were gone. His only remaining option for salvaging something from the battle was night surface action. By choosing not to take that risk, he guaranteed that the defeat would be total rather than partial. This is what I mean about psychological factors overwhelming operational logic. Yamamoto had just watched his carrier force destroyed. The shock of that loss apparently paralyzed his decision-making at the critical moment when aggressive action might have changed the outcome. There's one more detail that crystallizes Yamamoto's hesitation. At 18:30 hours, he briefly ordered his fleet to prepare for night action. This order appears in multiple ships' logs. Then, 15 minutes later, he countermanded it. He changed his mind. We can see the indecision happening in real time through the documentary record. He considers attacking. He orders preparation. Then he reverses himself. What changed in those 15 minutes? Did he receive new intelligence that concerned him? Did his staff argue against the action? Did he simply lose his nerve? The records don't say. We just know that in the 15 minutes between ordering preparation for night action and canceling that order, Yamamoto made the decision that ensured Japan's defeat at Midway would be complete. The morning of June 5th brought a postscript to this decision. During the night withdrawal, two Japanese heavy cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma, collided during a maneuver. Both were damaged. Both were slowed. The next day, American aircraft found them and sank Mikuma, severely damaging Mogami. These ships were lost not to combat, but to the confusion of hasty nighttime maneuvering during a withdrawal that shouldn't have happened. If Yamamoto had committed to night action, these cruisers would have been advancing toward the enemy in formation, not fumbling in the dark, trying to retreat. The collision itself is a small detail, but it symbolizes the chaos that comes from strategic irresolution. When you don't know whether you're advancing or retreating, whether you're committed to action or withdrawal, mistakes happen. I cannot escape the suspicion that Yamamoto's gambler instinct failed him precisely when boldness might have salvaged something from disaster. He'd gambled on the carrier battle and lost. That failure apparently exhausted his willingness to take further risks, but the situation called for doubling down, not folding. His battleships represented a strategic asset that couldn't be used during daylight carrier operations, but could be decisive at night. By failing to commit them, he wasted that asset. The defeat at Midway became total when it might have been partial. And all because an admiral who'd built his reputation on calculated risk-taking chose caution at the one moment when caution guaranteed defeat. Chapter 13. The Pilot Who Couldn't Be Replaced. Human Capital Destruction. Late May 1942. Naval Air Station Yokosuka. Lieutenant Shoichi Ogawa sits in a ready room updating his flight logbook. The entries are meticulous, recorded in careful handwriting that reflects years of military discipline. Total flight hours, 2,247. Carrier landings, 311. Combat sorties, 83. These numbers represent nearly a decade of flying, from his initial training in the early 1930s, through combat operations across China, through Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean raids. Ogawa is not exceptional by Kido Butai standards. He's simply experienced. He's survived long enough to accumulate expertise that cannot be taught, only earned through repetition. His logbook's final entry is dated June 3, 1942. The next page is water-damaged and illegible. Ogawa died at Midway, and with him died 2,000 hours of irreplaceable experience. The human capital destruction at Midway is often overshadowed by the loss of ships. 4 carriers sunk captures attention. Headlines. Strategic analysis focuses on tonnage, on industrial capacity to replace hulls. But ships can be built in 18 months if you have the shipyards and steel. A 2,000-hour pilot takes 5 years to create, and that's if everything goes right, if training fuel is available, if experienced instructors exist, if the candidate survives the dangerous learning process. Japan lost 110 aircrew at Midway. Of those, 43 had over 1,500 flight hours. They represented approximately 8% of the Fleet Air Force's veteran cadre. This percentage seems small until you understand that carrier aviation depends on a core of extremely experienced pilots who can operate in marginal conditions, who can lead formations, who can train the next generation. Losing 8% of that core in a single day isn't sustainable. Let me quantify what 1,500 flight hours means in practical terms. A pilot with that experience has conducted approximately 150 carrier landings, the most dangerous routine operation in naval aviation. He's learned to land on a moving deck in darkness, in weather, in combat damage situations where the flight deck is partially obstructed. He's developed the muscle memory that lets him make instant corrections during approach without conscious thought. He knows, instinctively, how his aircraft behaves at the edge of the flight envelope, how much altitude he can trade for airspeed, where the margins are. This knowledge cannot be taught in a classroom. It can only be acquired through survival of repeated exposure to risk. Every veteran pilot at Midway represented years of expensive, dangerous training that had successfully produced expertise. Every loss was permanent. The comparison with American pilot training is instructive. In May of 1942, Japan graduated 100 new carrier-qualified pilots. Average flight hours, approximately 300. The United States graduated 425 naval aviators. Average flight hours, approximately 250. The Japanese pilots had more training per capita, but the American advantage was in volume. Now, consider attrition. Japan's pilot training pipeline was designed to produce quality, highly trained individuals who could operate independently and lead formations. But it was a low-volume pipeline. It couldn't scale. There was no reserve capacity. When experienced pilots were lost, they could be replaced numerically by new graduates, but not experientially. A 300-hour pilot cannot do what a 2,000-hour pilot can do. The skills are categorically different. The fuel arithmetic controlled everything. Pilot training consumes vast amounts of aviation fuel. Every training flight, every practice landing, every formation drill burns fuel that could otherwise go to combat operations. Japan budgeted 18 gallons of fuel per pilot per training hour. This was adequate in peacetime, but by mid-1942, with combat operations consuming fuel at unprecedented rates and tanker capacity constrained by submarine attrition, the training allocation was under pressure. By 1944, the allocation had dropped to 7 gallons per pilot per hour. You cannot maintain the same training standards when fuel allocation drops by 60%. You reduce flight hours. You simplify the curriculum. You graduate pilots who are minimally qualified rather than thoroughly prepared. The quality spiral begins. There's a specific comparison that illustrates this. Carrier landing qualification. The ability to land on a moving carrier deck requires repetition to develop competence. American training doctrine called for 300 practice landings before a pilot was considered fully qualified. Japanese doctrine called for 150 landings. This wasn't because Japanese training was inferior in concept. It was because fuel constraints limited the number of practice landings that could be offered. 150 landings is adequate to produce basic competence. 300 landings produces mastery. The difference becomes apparent when conditions degrade. Night landings, weather, combat damage. The pilot with 300 landings has margins the pilot with 150 doesn't, and those margins determine survival. The instructional pipeline compounded the problem. Experienced pilots like Ogawa served as instructors between combat deployments. A pilot with 2,000 hours could teach tactics, could share combat lessons, could demonstrate advanced techniques. But as combat attrition increased through 1943 and 1944, experienced pilots were retained in combat units rather than being rotated to training duty. The Navy needed every experienced aviator in operational squadrons. This meant new pilots were increasingly being trained by instructors who had 600 hours, not 2,000. The instructor quality declined. The graduate quality declined. The negative feedback loop accelerated. By October of 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese pilot quality had degraded to the point where American pilots described the engagement as a turkey shoot. Japanese aircraft were shot down in overwhelming numbers, often before reaching attack position. These pilots weren't cowards. They weren't incompetent. They were simply inadequately trained, facing opponents who had better training, better equipment, and more combat experience. The gap that started at Midway, where Japan lost a significant portion of its veteran cadre, had widened into a chasm over 2 years of attrition that the training pipeline couldn't replace. I find myself haunted by the logbooks. They're preserved in archives, Japanese National Institute for Defense Studies, U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command, private collections. Page after page of flight hours, recorded in neat columns. Each entry represents a sortie, a training flight, a combat mission. The entries stop when the pilot dies. Ogawa's logbook stops on June 3rd. Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga's stops on June 4th. Lieutenant Kobayashi's continues for another year before ending at Rabaul in 1943. These aren't abstract statistics. They're individual expertise, accumulated over years, lost in minutes. and each loss narrowed the expertise base available for training the next generation. The strategic implications were understood at the time, even if they couldn't be corrected. A Japanese Navy planning document from late 1942, declassified in the 1990s, contains a stark assessment. Pilot quality will decline progressively throughout 1943 and 1944 due to training fuel constraints and instructor experience deficits. This decline is mathematically certain and cannot be reversed without reduction in operational tempo. The assessment was correct, but reducing operational tempo meant ceding initiative to the Americans, meant allowing them to advance unopposed. So the operations continued. The fuel got burned in combat rather than training, and the quality declined exactly as predicted. There's one final detail that captures the human capital tragedy. The Japanese Navy rejected an Army proposal in mid-1942 to cross-train Army fighter pilots for carrier duty. The Army had thousands of experienced pilots. They flew different aircraft and had different tactical doctrine, but the basic flying skills were transferable. Cross-training would have taken perhaps 6 months and would have added 200 qualified pilots to the carrier pool. The Navy refused. Inter-service rivalry, concern about diluting Navy culture, resistance to accepting Army help. The reasons varied depending on who you asked. But the result was that qualified pilots existed in Japan, were available to fill the gaps left by Midway's losses, and were never used because institutional pride prevented cooperation. Ogawa's logbook, with its 2,247 hours, represents an investment Japan couldn't afford to lose and couldn't afford to replace. Each page is a record of fuel consumed, time invested, risk survived. When that logbook's entries stopped on June 3rd, all that investment was lost. Multiply Ogawa by 43, the number of 1,500+ hour pilots lost at Midway, and you begin to understand the scope of the human capital destruction. The carriers could theoretically be replaced, though Japan's industrial capacity made even that doubtful. The pilots could not be replaced, not in the timeline available, not with the resources allocated. The war would continue for 3 more years, but the quality advantage Japan held in early 1942 was gone, and it was never recovered. Chapter 14, The Intelligence War, Code-Breaking's Second Act. The 8th of July, 1942, Navy Ministry, Tokyo. Commander Chihaya Takahashi sits at his desk drafting a memo. The memo is addressed to the Vice Chief of Naval Staff. Its subject is code security. Takahashi has been reviewing the Midway operation and has reached a disturbing conclusion. The Americans knew. They knew where the Japanese fleet would be, when it would arrive, what its objectives were. This level of foreknowledge suggests systematic compromise of Japanese communications security. Takahashi's memo is careful, professional, backed by analysis of American radio behavior and operational decisions. His recommendation is direct. Immediate replacement of JN-25D codebook. Probability of compromise approaches certainty given enemy foreknowledge. The memo is dated July 8th. In the margin, a superior officer has written a response. Defeatist thinking. No action required. The memo is filed. The code is not changed. The compromise continues. The refusal to change codes after Midway reveals institutional psychology more clearly than any tactical decision. Accepting that your codes have been broken requires accepting that the enemy has achieved something you considered impossible. It requires admitting that your communications security, which Japanese doctrine held as essentially unbreakable, has failed. This admission would have cascading implications. If the codes were broken, then every operation planned using those codes might have been compromised. Every setback might be reinterpreted as intelligence failure rather than tactical misfortune. The entire strategic picture would need reassessment. This level of institutional self-examination is psychologically difficult, even in organizations with healthy self-criticism cultures. In the Imperial Japanese Navy of 1942, with its emphasis on face-saving and consensus, it was apparently impossible. The evidence of compromise was overwhelming to anyone willing to look. On June 10th, the Naval General Staff conducted a post-battle assessment. Multiple officers noted that American forces were positioned as if they'd known Japanese plans in advance. The carriers were in exactly the right location. They were reinforced beyond what random deployment would suggest. The timing of their attack suggested they'd known the Japanese schedule. All of this pointed to signals intelligence. But the official assessment attributed American success to radar-based detection and operational luck. Code compromise wasn't mentioned, not because evidence was lacking, but because accepting that evidence would require actions, code changes, operational review, strategic reassessment that were institutionally threatening. Station HYPO, meanwhile, continued reading Japanese traffic. The JN25D code that had been partially broken before Midway remained in use throughout June and July. American cryptographers continued their work. By mid-July, they'd improved their penetration from roughly 40% of messages to closer to 50%. They knew where Japanese carriers were. They knew reinforcement schedules for Guadalcanal. They knew fuel status for major ships. This intelligence advantage shaped every subsequent operation in the Pacific. And Japan, by refusing to acknowledge the compromise, ensured the advantage would continue. There's a source conflict in the post-war record about exactly when JN25 was changed. Some Japanese memoirists claim codes were changed on June 15th, immediately after Midway. National Security Agency declassifications from the 2000s show JN25D remained in primary use until August 1st. That's a 6-week discrepancy. Who's lying? Probably both, in different ways. It's possible some additive books were changed in mid-June, providing a psychological sense that something was done about security. But the core codebook remained unchanged. The Americans continued reading traffic. The apparent conflict reflects different understandings of what changing codes meant. Superficial updates versus comprehensive replacement. The cost of this denial is quantifiable. In August, Japan began the Guadalcanal campaign. American intelligence read Japanese reinforcement schedules, knew which convoys were carrying troops versus supplies, knew when bombardment missions were planned. This allowed American forces to position interceptors, to ambush convoys, to avoid bombardments. Japanese forces attributed these American responses to spies, or coast watchers, or radar. The possibility that Americans were reading the operational orders was dismissed. By November, the Guadalcanal campaign had consumed enormous Japanese resources, ships, aircraft, and critically, pilots, to achieve essentially nothing. Could better communication security have changed that outcome? Possibly. At minimum, it would have forced Americans to rely on less precise intelligence, to take more operational risks, to position forces less efficiently. The technical fix was neither difficult nor expensive. JN25 used a 2-stage encryption, codebook plus additive book. Changing the additive book alone would have blinded American cryptographers for weeks, possibly months. The additive book was smaller, easier to distribute, could be changed without retraining communications personnel. Printing new additive books would have cost approximately $47,000 in contemporary currency. The ships lost at Guadalcanal alone cost over $280 million. The return on investment for code security was roughly 6,000 to 1. But the investment was never made, because doing so would have required admitting the compromise existed. There's a fascinating psychological parallel here. When Station HYPO first began reading JN25 in early 1942, the American Navy's reaction was careful skepticism. How do we know these decrypts are accurate and not deception? What if the Japanese are feeding us false information through codes they know we've broken? The Americans spent weeks validating decrypt accuracy, cross-referencing with other intelligence sources, testing predictions against outcomes. This skepticism was healthy. It prevented overconfidence. The Japanese response to possible compromise was the opposite: denial. Not, let's investigate whether this is true, but this cannot be true, therefore it isn't true. The psychological investment in code security being unbreakable was so strong that evidence of compromise was rejected rather than investigated. A junior cryptographer at Japanese Naval headquarters kept personal logs showing unusual American radio discipline changes in May of 1942. He noted that American carriers had significantly reduced radio traffic, had changed call signs more frequently, had modified operating procedures in ways that suggested they were trying to minimize signal exposure. These are behaviors typical of a force that knows it's being monitored and is trying to reduce its electronic signature. The cryptographer wrote a memo suggesting these changes indicated the Americans might be reading Japanese traffic. He was reassigned to a destroyer escort in the South Pacific. His memo was filed and forgotten. This is what happens when institutional culture punishes truth-telling. People stop telling the truth. By January of 1943, when JN-25 was finally comprehensively replaced, American cryptographic infrastructure had matured to the point where they broke the new code within 2 weeks and were reading 70% of traffic within a month. The delay in changing codes meant Americans had extra months to refine their techniques, to understand Japanese communication procedures, to build cribs and recovery methods that could be applied to future systems. The window of opportunity to restore communication security had closed, not because American cryptography was unstoppable, but because Japan had given them so much time to perfect their methods. I find myself angry at historical ghosts when reading this material. The evidence of compromise was clear. The solution was affordable and technically straightforward. The consequences of inaction were catastrophic. And yet, the codes were not changed for months, because admitting the problem existed was culturally impossible. How many ships could have been saved? How many pilots? How many operations might have succeeded if the Americans hadn't known the plan in advance? These are unanswerable questions, but the fact that they have to be asked at all represents a failure not of technology or tactics, but of institutional honesty. Japan lost the intelligence war at Midway, and then, by refusing to acknowledge that loss, they ensured they would continue losing it for months to come. Chapter 15. The submarine that finished the job, USS Nautilus and Kaga's death. The 4th of June, 1942, 08:55 hours. USS Nautilus, submerged at periscope depth, approximately 20 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander William Brockman peers through the periscope and sees what he later describes as the most beautiful target array I've ever witnessed. 4 Japanese carriers, multiple escorts, all steaming in formation toward Midway. Brockman has been hunting these carriers since before dawn. He's been depth-charged, force-deep, tracked by destroyers, and nearly rammed. His periscope has been damaged by near-miss explosions. His boat smells of hydraulic fluid, sweat, and the peculiar metallic odor that comes from extended submersion. But none of that matters because he's found the enemy. He orders battle stations. Torpedo. The approach begins. Nautilus is slow, clumsy compared to surface ships, but she's persistent. And in naval warfare, persistence often matters more than speed. USS Nautilus was a fleet submarine, commissioned in 1930. By 1942 standards, she was obsolescent. Newer boats had better systems, quieter engines, more sophisticated fire control. But Nautilus had one advantage. She was present at Midway when newer boats were not. Her displacement submerged was 2,730 tons. Her maximum speed underwater was 8 knots. On the surface, she could make 20 knots, but on the surface, she was vulnerable to aircraft and gunfire. Her primary weapons were 6 21-inch torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 aft, loaded with Mark 14 torpedoes. Each torpedo carried a 643-pound warhead. In theory, this was enough to cripple or sink a carrier. In practice, the Mark 14 had problems Brockman was about to discover. The approach to attack position takes over an hour. Nautilus can't move quickly submerged. Every time she raises the periscope, Japanese destroyers spot the wake and attack with depth charges. Brockman goes deep, evades, comes back to periscope depth, reacquires the target, and continues closing. At 0940 hours, he fires 3 torpedoes at what he identifies as a Congo-class battleship. All 3 miss. The fire control solution was slightly off. Calculating torpedo intercept courses against moving targets is as much art as science, especially through a damaged periscope. The torpedoes run past the battleship. Nautilus goes deep as destroyers converge on her position. Depth charges explode close enough to knock out electrical lighting. The crew switches to battle lanterns. Brockman waits. At 1000 hours, he surfaces briefly to observe. The carriers are under air attack. American dive bombers are arriving. Brockman watches through the periscope as bombs fall and carriers begin burning. This is both encouraging, the carriers are being hit, and frustrating. Submarines work best against ships that aren't already sinking. Nautilus submerges again and begins stalking the crippled ships. By 1300 hours, the Japanese formation has dispersed. Burning carriers are being abandoned. Destroyers are picking up survivors. And one carrier, Kaga, is still afloat, drifting, flames visible from her flight deck. Brockman maneuvers Nautilus into position for another attack. At 13:59 hours, Nautilus fires 3 torpedoes at Kaga from approximately 3,000 yards. This is close range for submarine attack, close enough that the torpedoes have time to arm, but not much margin for evasion by the target. Kaga is effectively stationary, unable to maneuver. The first torpedo misses ahead. The second appears to hit near the waterline amidships. The third hits astern. Brockman observes at least one distinct explosion on Kaga. He notes it in Nautilus's patrol report, preserved now in the National Archives. Sighted 4 carriers, multiple escorts. Commenced attack. Depth charged 42 times. Periscope damaged. Continuing attack. The page has coffee stains and what appears to be hydraulic fluid. The conditions aboard Nautilus during this attack were not comfortable. Here's where the historical evidence becomes ambiguous. Brockman's report claims torpedo hits on Kaga contributed to her sinking. Japanese damage reports, reconstructed from survivor testimony because the ship's logs were lost, make no mention of submarine torpedo hits. They attribute Kaga's sinking entirely to bomb damage and uncontrollable fires. Who's correct? Both, possibly. Kaga was already doomed from the bomb hits. She was burning uncontrollably. She would have sunk eventually, regardless of torpedo damage. But torpedoes hitting below the waterline might have accelerated the flooding, might have made damage control efforts even more futile, might have hastened the final sinking. The contribution is marginal, but not zero. What's not ambiguous is the psychological effect of submarine presence. Japanese destroyers had to maintain anti-submarine patrols around the burning carriers. This meant destroyers were engaged in depth-charging submarines rather than rescuing survivors. It meant fewer resources available for towing attempts or firefighting support. The submarines didn't sink the carriers. American dive bombers did that. But they complicated every aspect of Japanese damage control and rescue operations. Nautilus and other American submarines in the area created a zone of threat that forced Japanese forces to divide attention between damage control and self-defense. The technical limitations of submarine warfare in 1942 are important context. Submarines were not the silent hunters of later decades. They were submersible torpedo boats, capable of diving to avoid surface threats, but fundamentally limited in speed and endurance underwater. Nautilus could remain submerged for perhaps 24 hours before battery depletion and carbon dioxide buildup forced her to surface. Her underwater speed of 8 knots meant she couldn't keep pace with surface ships making 15 or 20 knots. She had to position herself ahead of the enemy's projected course, wait for them to come to her, and hope the fire control solution was accurate when she fired. This required patience, calculation, and tolerance for extreme discomfort. The depth-charging Nautilus endured was severe. 42 separate depth charge attacks over the course of the day. Each attack involved multiple charges, typically 3 to 6 per attack pattern, which means Nautilus absorbed somewhere between 120 and 250 depth charge explosions at various ranges. Close explosions could buckle hull plates, shatter gauge glasses, rupture piping, and concuss the crew. Distant explosions were more psychological than physical. The crew could hear them, could feel the pressure waves, knew that the next one might be closer. The patrol report's notation of 42 times is matter of fact, almost bureaucratic. But each of those attacks represented minutes or hours of extreme stress for the 70-man crew. What strikes me about Brockman's decision-making is the persistence. After the first attack failed, he didn't withdraw. After being depth-charged repeatedly, he didn't break off. After his periscope was damaged, he continued operating with degraded vision. The stubbornness is remarkable. Some might call it recklessness. Continuing to attack when the primary targets were already doomed from air attack seems to add risk without commensurate gain. But submarines at Midway had been ordered to intercept the Japanese fleet. Brockman interpreted that as, attack every valid target until you're out of torpedoes or the targets are sunk. He followed orders with literal precision. The Mark 14 torpedo's defects become relevant here. Post-war analysis revealed the Mark 14 had multiple serious flaws. The magnetic exploder often detonated prematurely. The contact exploder sometimes failed to detonate at all, particularly on perpendicular hits where the torpedo struck at a right angle. The depth-keeping mechanism frequently caused torpedoes to run deeper than set, passing under targets without hitting. These weren't minor issues. They were systemic design and manufacturing defects that reduced the weapon's effectiveness by perhaps 60 to 70%. Brockman and other submarine commanders didn't know the full extent of these problems in June of 1942. They knew torpedoes often failed, but they attributed it to operator error or bad luck rather than systematic weapon defects. Nautilus fired 41 torpedoes total during the Midway operation, not all at the carriers, but at various Japanese ships over several days. The exact hit rate is unclear because confirming torpedo hits from a submerged submarine is difficult, but the patrol report claims multiple hits, while Japanese records confirm far fewer. The discrepancy probably reflects a combination of Mark 14 defects, torpedoes that appeared to hit but didn't detonate, or detonated prematurely and were mistaken for hits, and the fog of war. Brockman believed he'd hit multiple targets. The Japanese records suggest fewer actual hits. Both perspectives are probably honestly reported, but differently observed. The broader strategic effect of American submarines at Midway was more harassment than destruction. They didn't sink any major Japanese ships through torpedo attack alone, but they forced Japanese forces to maneuver defensively, to divert destroyers for anti-submarine work, to maintain constant sonar watch, to zigzag rather than steam directly. This increased fuel consumption, slowed transit times, and created operational friction. It's the kind of effect that doesn't show up clearly in battle statistics, but accumulates over the course of a campaign. The submarines at Midway were a persistent annoyance that became, over time and across multiple engagements, a significant operational constraint. When I read Brockman's patrol report, the complete document runs over 60 pages, covering multiple weeks of patrol before and after Midway. What emerges is a picture of submarine warfare as an exercise in patience, punctuated by brief moments of extreme violence, hours of slow maneuvering, minutes of attack, hours of evasion, repeat. The romanticism of submarine warfare, the Hollywood image of silent hunters, doesn't match the reality of diesel fumes, inadequate ventilation, 70 men living in close quarters, depth charges shaking the hull, and torpedoes that don't work reliably. Brockman's stubbornness in the face of all this, attacking a carrier force solo, enduring 42 depth charge attacks, continuing to operate with damaged equipment, is either admirable or insane, depending on your perspective. Probably both. Kaga sank at approximately 1925 hours on June 4th. Whether Nautilus's torpedoes contributed meaningfully to that sinking remains debatable. What's certain is that Brockman tried. He positioned his submarine in harm's way, absorbed punishment, and fired every torpedo he could bring to bear. In the arithmetic of war, attempting to kill a target and failing is still operationally preferable to not attempting at all. Nautilus didn't sink Kaga alone, but she was there, attacking, creating problems for Japanese damage control, forcing resource allocation to anti-submarine defense. In aggregate, across all American submarines present at Midway, these marginal effects mattered, not decisively, but not insignificantly either. Chapter 16, The Propaganda War. How both sides lied to themselves. The 7th of June, 1942, Tokyo. Masanori Ito sits at a typewriter in a small office near the Navy Ministry. Ito is a naval correspondent, embedded with the fleet for the Midway operation. He's just returned to Tokyo. He's seen the burning carriers. He's talked to survivors. He knows what happened. And now he has to write a dispatch for Japanese newspapers explaining the battle. He types, Japanese forces achieved tactical success at Midway. Enemy forces repulsed. Minor losses to Imperial Japanese Navy. The words appear on paper. They're lies. Comprehensive, systematic lies. But they're the lies he's been instructed to write. The editor will review the dispatch. The editor asks, "Did you mean to write strategic success rather than tactical success?" Ito stares at the page. His hands shake slightly. He changes tactical to strategic. The dispatch is filed. The newspapers will publish it. And millions of Japanese citizens will believe, for months or years, that Midway was a victory. Ito's personal diary, discovered among his effects after he died in 1968, contains an entry for June 7th. Wrote dispatch. Japanese forces achieved tactical success at Midway. The editor asked if I meant to write strategic success. I changed it. My hands shook. The ink is smudged, as if written quickly or with emotional agitation. The diary continues. 4 carriers gone, thousands dead. And I write, success, what have I become? This is the private voice, the honest accounting. But the public voice, the voice that reaches Japanese newspapers and radio broadcasts, tells a completely different story. The Japanese propaganda approach to Midway was comprehensive denial. On June 10th, newspapers in Tokyo, Osaka, and other major cities carried headlines about the Midway victory. Details were vague, no specific ship names, no casualty figures, just generalized claims of success. Enemy forces withdrawing in disarray. Imperial Navy controls strategic waters. The careful reader might have noticed what wasn't being said. No mention of American ships sunk, no mention of territorial gains, just vague references to tactical success and enemy withdrawal. But most readers weren't careful. They were patriotic citizens eager for good news. They believed what they were told. The Americans were lying too, but differently. U.S. newspapers on June 6th carried headlines about the Midway victory. They claimed 4 to 5 Japanese carriers sunk, which was accurate, but they also claimed 10 or more cruisers sunk, multiple battleships damaged, and total Japanese casualties exceeding 20,000. These numbers were inflated, the product of over-enthusiastic pilot claims mixed with genuine uncertainty about battle damage. American pilots had reported hitting many more ships than were actually hit. Intelligence analysts had inflated these claims and reports, and newspapers, eager for dramatic news, had published the most optimistic assessments. The core narrative, American victory, Japanese defeat, was true, but the details were exaggerated. What fascinates me about comparing American and Japanese reporting is not that both sides lied, but how they lied differently. American lies were lies of magnitude. The victory was real, but the scale was inflated. Japanese lies were lies of direction. They claimed victory when they'd suffered defeat. American public morale was boosted by exaggerated success. Japanese public morale was maintained by fabricated success. The American lies would be corrected over subsequent months as more accurate assessments emerged. The Japanese lies would be maintained for years, growing more elaborate and divorced from reality as the war continued. The treatment of survivors reveals the depth of Japanese information control. Sailors who survived the sinking carriers were quarantined on isolated naval bases. They were given direct orders not to discuss the battle with anyone, including family. Letters home were censored. Any reference to carrier losses was redacted. The official notification to families of dead sailors said only that their sons or husbands had died heroically in the South Pacific. No mention of Midway, no mention of which ship, just vague references to heroic death in service to the emperor. This wasn't unusual for wartime casualties. All nations censor casualty information to some degree. But the systematic erasure of Midway from the official record went beyond normal security. It was denial elevated to policy. By September of 1942, rumors were circulating in Japan about carrier losses. People talk. Sailors on leave whisper to families. Families talk to neighbors. The truth seeps out through informal networks despite official censorship. But rumors without confirmation are just rumors. The official story, that Midway was a success, remained the public record. And most Japanese citizens, in the absence of contradictory official information, believed the official story. Why wouldn't they? Their government had no incentive to lie about victories, or so the reasoning went. The anniversary propaganda is particularly revealing. On June 4, 1943, 1 year after the battle, Japanese radio broadcasts featured veterans of the Midway victory discussing their experiences. These were carefully scripted testimonials, probably featuring sailors who'd been at Midway, but certainly not allowed to discuss what actually happened. The broadcasts emphasized Japanese heroism, American cowardice, and ultimate Japanese victory. They were pure fabrication, masquerading as first-person testimony. American radio, the same day, broadcast retrospectives on the turning point in the Pacific War. This framing, Midway as the decisive turning point, was also somewhat fabricated. The battle was important, certainly, but whether it was the turning point or just a turning point wasn't clear in June 1943. That narrative was imposed retroactively. There's a source conflict about when ordinary Japanese civilians learned the truth about Midway. Some post-war Japanese accounts claim the truth was widely known by mid-1943, through rumors and informal networks. American intelligence assessments from intercepted civilian mail suggest most Japanese civilians remained ignorant of the defeat until 1945 or later. Who's right? Probably both, in different contexts. Urban civilians with connections to naval personnel might have heard rumors. Rural civilians with no such connections probably believed the official narrative. Knowledge distribution in wartime is never uniform. What strikes me about reading parallel newspaper accounts from Tokyo and New York in June of 1942 is how both sides were simultaneously confident and lying. Japanese newspapers expressed certainty in ultimate victory, while hiding catastrophic defeats. American newspapers expressed certainty in ultimate victory, while inflating tactical successes. Both nations needed to believe they were winning. Both governments understood that public morale required a narrative of success, so both governments provided that narrative. Truth be damned. The long-term effect of this propaganda was psychological. Japanese civilians who believed Midway was a victory experienced shock and betrayal when they learned the truth after the war. The government had lied to them, not about small details, but about fundamental reality. This contributed to post-war disillusionment with military and governmental authority. American civilians who believed exaggerated victory claims experienced a different kind of disappointment as the war dragged on for 3 more years. If we'd sunk 10 cruisers at Midway, why was the Navy still fighting in the Pacific in 1945? The mismatch between propaganda and reality created cynicism. Ito's diary, with its smudged ink and confession of shaking hands, represents the human cost of institutional lying. He knew the truth. He wrote lies. He lived with that contradiction for the rest of his life. His diary entries from later years occasionally reference Midway, always with expressions of guilt and shame. He survived the war. He continued working as a journalist, but he never published the truth about what he'd seen at Midway until decades later, long after the war had ended, and the truth no longer mattered strategically. By then it was just history, and history, even when finally told truthfully, cannot undo the lies that shaped how millions of people understood the war as it was happening. Chapter 17. The Counterfactual. How Japan Could Have Won Midway. A blank page. That's what remains in Admiral Nagumo's personal effects under the label Contingency Plans, Midway Operation. The page was never filled in. No backup plans, no alternative scenarios, no consideration of what happens if the primary plan fails. This absence is itself a historical document. It suggests a certain mindset, confidence that the plan would work as designed, or perhaps institutional culture that discouraged visible consideration of failure. Either way, the blank page raises a question that historians have wrestled with for decades. Could Japan have won at Midway? Not should they have won in some moral sense, but could they have won, in the sense of alternative decisions leading to different outcomes? The answer is yes, with caveats. There were at least 5 decision points where different choices plausibly changed the battle's outcome. Not with certainty. History doesn't offer certainty in counterfactuals, but with probabilities significant enough to matter. The first decision point is force concentration in late April. Yamamoto divided his available carriers between Midway and the Aleutians. 4 carriers went to Midway. 2 went to the Aleutians. This gave Nagumo approximately 250 aircraft. If all 6 carriers had been concentrated at Midway, he would have had approximately 370 aircraft, a 50% increase in striking power, and, more importantly, in defensive coverage. Combat air patrol density matters. With 6 carriers, Nagumo could have maintained continuous fighter coverage at multiple altitudes while still preparing strike packages. The vulnerability that killed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, dive bombers arriving when the combat air patrol was at the wrong altitude, becomes less likely with 50% more fighters available. I've examined war game simulations conducted by the U.S. Naval War College in the 1970s, attempting to model a 6-carrier Japanese force at Midway. The simulations are imperfect. They make assumptions about pilot quality, damage control effectiveness, and American tactical responses that might not hold. But they're instructive. The median outcome across multiple simulation runs shows Japan sinking 2 American carriers while losing 1 to 2 Japanese carriers. That's a Pyrrhic victory at best, but it's strategically different from losing 4 carriers while sinking 1. The Americans would still have Enterprise or Hornet operational. They'd still hold Midway. but the Kido Butai would survive as a functional force. Japan would retain offensive capability in the Pacific for at least another 6 months. The second decision point is code security in mid-May. Commander Takahashi's memo recommending immediate JN-25 code replacement was written on May 15th and rejected on May 16th. If that recommendation had been accepted, American cryptographic advantage disappears. Nimitz would still know something is happening. Traffic analysis and direction finding would show a major Japanese operation preparing, but he wouldn't know the specific target or timing. This transforms Midway from an ambush into a meeting engagement. The Americans might still position carriers to defend Midway, but they wouldn't know exactly when to expect the Japanese attack. The timing coordination that allowed McCluskey and Leslie to arrive simultaneously becomes unlikely. The battle becomes messier, more chaotic, and outcomes become less predictable. The third decision point is mechanical maintenance on June 3rd. The Tone catapult hydraulic seal was worn, leaking pressure. Replacing that seal overnight would have taken 90 minutes. Nobody made that call. If they had, the number 4 scout plane launches on time at 0430 instead of 0445. That 30-minute difference means Ensign Amari reaches his search sector earlier, spots the American carriers at approximately 0700 hours instead of 0730. This 30-minute earlier warning arrives while Nagumo's flight decks are still clear, before the critical decision about rearming becomes operationally binding. With earlier warning, Nagumo can launch his anti-ship strike before the American dive bombers arrive. Does this change the outcome? Possibly. At minimum, it means some Japanese aircraft get into the air and attack American carriers. Whether they sink one or more American carriers depends on execution, but the probability of Japanese success increases significantly with earlier detection. The fourth decision point is doctrine flexibility at 0715 hours on June 4th. Nagumo receives a report that a second strike on Midway Island is necessary to suppress its defenses. He orders rearming from torpedoes to bombs. This decision follows Genda's doctrine of eliminating the nearest threat first. But it's not the only option. Nagumo could have maintained the torpedo armament and kept half his strike force ready for anti-ship work, while sending the other half against Midway with whatever weapons they already carried. This sacrifices doctrinal purity for operational flexibility. It means the anti-ship strike is smaller, but it's immediately available when American carriers are detected at 0820. The difference between a 20-minute launch time and a 90-minute rearm time is the difference between hitting the Americans first versus being hit first. The fifth decision point is night action, on June 4th evening. At 1900 hours, Yamamoto commands overwhelming surface superiority. 11 battleships versus 3 American carriers that have minimal night fighting capability. If Yamamoto orders maximum speed advance for night surface engagement, his battleships can close to gun range by midnight or shortly after. American carriers have to choose: withdraw east and abandon Midway, or stay and risk destruction by gunfire. This forces Spruance into a difficult tactical position. Does Japanese night action guarantee victory? No. American submarines might intercept. American destroyers might launch torpedo attacks. The risks are significant, but the potential payoff, sinking one or more American carriers, is also significant. And failing to attempt night action guarantees that the daytime defeat remains total rather than partial. Each of these decision points involves trade-offs. Concentrating all 6 carriers at Midway means abandoning the Aleutians operation entirely. Changing codes in mid-May might alert the Americans that Japan knows their communications are compromised, potentially triggering American code changes. Replacing the catapult seal overnight delays other maintenance. Maintaining doctrine flexibility requires accepting smaller strike sizes. Night action risks battleships to submarine attack. These aren't cost-free decisions, but they're plausible alternatives that might have changed outcomes. The cumulative probability calculation is revealing. If Japan makes optimal decisions at all 5 points, concentrates forces, changes codes, fixes the catapult, maintains flexible loadouts, and pursues night action, what's the probability of Japanese victory at Midway? Naval historians have attempted this calculation using Monte Carlo simulation methods. The methodology involves running thousands of simulated battles, with varying assumptions about pilot quality, damage control, weather, and random chance. The results suggest Japanese victory probability shifts from less than 5% historically to approximately 35 to 40% with optimized decision-making. This is still not a guaranteed win. Even with better decisions, Japan faces significant disadvantages. American radar provides detection advantages. American damage control is superior. American industrial capacity means losses can be replaced faster. But 40% is different from 5%. 40% means Midway becomes genuinely uncertain rather than an almost certain Japanese defeat. And uncertainty creates strategic options that certainty doesn't allow. There's one more counterfactual worth considering, because it's the simplest: delay. If Japan attacks Midway in July instead of June, just 1 month later, the operational picture changes significantly. USS Yorktown would be in dry dock for repairs after the Coral Sea battle. She wouldn't be present at Midway. This reduces American carrier strength from 3 to 2. Enterprise and Hornet versus 4 Japanese carriers is different mathematics than 3 American carriers versus 4 Japanese. It's still a difficult battle for Japan, but the margins shift. More time also allows better planning, more training, and potentially better intelligence about American dispositions. Why wasn't this option chosen? Because Yamamoto felt urgency. He wanted to force the decisive battle before American industrial production made it impossible. The irony is that by rushing into battle unprepared, he ensured the decisive battle happened on American terms, rather than Japanese terms. I present these counterfactuals not as wish fulfillment, but as respect for contingency. History is not predetermined. Midway's outcome was heavily influenced by Japanese mistakes and American advantages, but it wasn't foreordained. Small changes, a seal replaced, a code changed, a decision to concentrate forces, cascade into large effects. This doesn't mean Japan would have won the Pacific War with different Midway outcomes. Their strategic position was fundamentally untenable given industrial disparities, but they might have delayed defeat, might have forced different peace negotiations, might have shaped the post-war settlement differently. The blank page in Nagumo's effects haunts me. No contingency plans, no consideration of what happens when the primary plan fails. This suggests an institution that had become overconfident, that couldn't imagine failure because they'd succeeded too consistently. The Americans, by contrast, had failed repeatedly in early 1942. They'd been pushed back across the Pacific. They'd lost battles and ships. This failure had made them cautious, careful, willing to consider multiple scenarios. Paradoxically, early American failures contributed to Midway's success by forcing institutional learning. Early Japanese successes contributed to Midway defeat by preventing that same learning. The final question is whether Midway was the turning point or simply a turning point. American propaganda labeled it the former. Historians debate this. My assessment is that Midway was a significant American victory that changed the strategic trajectory, but not necessarily a decisive turning point. Japan's fundamental weakness, industrial inferiority, predated Midway and would have asserted itself regardless. What Midway did was accelerate the timeline. It destroyed Japan's carrier fleet 18 months earlier than attrition would have. It gave Americans confidence and initiative. It proved that Japanese forces could be defeated through intelligence, planning, and execution. These effects mattered, but whether they were decisive or merely accelerating depends on counterfactuals we cannot definitively answer. Nagumo's blank page remains blank. History records what happened, not what might have happened. Japan lost Midway. 4 carriers sunk, the Kido Butai destroyed, the initiative permanently lost. These are facts, but the counterfactuals, the plausible alternative histories where different decisions lead to different outcomes, remind us that facts are contingent. They're the result of decisions made by humans under pressure, with imperfect information, and decisions can always be made differently. That Yamamoto and Nagumo made the decisions they did tells us something about institutional culture, about strategic thinking, about the limitations of doctrinal rigidity. The battle they lost was losable. It wasn't fated. And that makes the loss both more tragic and more instructive.